Alrighty, and we're on. So I'm sitting here with you're currently Deacon Josh.
Currently, yeah.
That will all change in only a week and a bit? Or?
About that, yeah. I think it's someone said 9 days. I've had a whole lot of people counting, so I haven't had to, which is great. So yeah, about 9 days.
So 9 days, and then you're going to be ordained as a priest.
Yep, that's right.
So so I guess for people that obviously don't know you. And we're going to get into it anyway, so they will start to obviously understand a bit more about you. But Angela was telling me, you got to sit down and do a podcast with Deacon Josh. And I was like, okay, cool. And then she was like, she sent me a couple of links and then also a link to your podcast and things like that. I was like, you're actually a pretty interesting dude.
I'm glad. There we go. Yep.
But interesting from the perspective that, the two, I guess, topics that you're probably very au fait with is politics and religion, which is two topics that most people would like to shy away from at the dinner parties, right?
Yep.
So from that perspective, let's sort of wind it all back so people can sort of understand a little bit more about you. Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I grew up in Campbelltown in the southwest of Sydney, so that's only about half an hour down the road from where we are here in Penshurst. And I grew up out there with I got two parents, obviously, mum and dad, Chris and Lisa, and they're wonderful. And I'm the youngest of 4 kids. So grew up out there and very kind of sort of pretty standard sort of Western Sydney upbringing. Yep. Loved my footy, loved my sport. Went to church on the weekends, did all the sacraments and all that sort of stuff. And it was very kind of. Pretty, I won't say boring, but pretty standard, at least what I sort of gather from everyone else anyway. So.
Fair enough. So youngest of 4 siblings, what's the age gap between them?
Yeah, so my older sister Sarah, she was born in 84, so she's 39, there we go. Yeah, in next month I think. And then Steph's 2 years younger than her. She was born in 86, and then Tim was born in 88, and then a little bit out of kilter, I'm born in 91, so okay. I ruined the every 2 year thing. But yeah, so I was born, so I'm about two and a half years younger than my brother. So I think there's about 7 and a half years between us, top to bottom. So.
Yep. And then, so out of curiosity, and selfishly, I'm sort of asking this for my own understanding with my kids, right? Like, what was that dynamic like? Yeah,
it was pretty good, I think. I definitely knew that I was kind of the youngest, and that little bit of an extra bit of an age gap. I probably felt that a little bit. I think, the others had sort of some people either side of them, really. And part of that was just I was kind of the sports head, the footy head in the family, and no one else really was. So sort of me and my dad, so we were the avid sports fans. So my siblings always joke that I was pretty clearly Dad's favourite, just because we could watch the footy together and watch the cricket together and all that sort of stuff. So, but it was good. I like I said, I definitely knew that I was probably the youngest, and so I'm probably not as close with my siblings as they probably are as each other. But that's not necessarily in a bad way. Just we're all still pretty close as well. So
when it's like between you and the eldest, it's a 7-year or so age gap. I can speak to that because I've got a brother who's 7 years older.
Yeah, okay.
Right. So I was the younger one, he was the older one, and I always use this little anecdote that for example, when I was 12 and he's 19. He wants to do 19-year-old things, and I'm here, this little annoying brother that wants to join him and go and hang out with his friends because to me they seem cool. Then they were doing big person things, right? Whereas to him it's like, here's this annoying little kid that I got to look after because he's the older one and he can shoulder the responsibility. And for my parents, they were always working, so it was like, okay, Donnie, you can go look after Johnny, you go do whatever you want, but then he'd have to bring me around. Probably wasn't a whole lot of fun for him, but for me it was like, great fun.
Yeah, I remember I have sort of this vivid memory of my sister's, so Sarah's 18th birthday party. And so we'd have a thing where mum and dad would say, look, you can have an 18th birthday party and you pick a theme, and then they'd sort of go all out and do all that. And so Sarah wanted a cocktail themed party, which is pretty dangerous for 18-year-olds, but they went ahead with it anyway. Yeah. And I remember the morning after, everyone had sort of slept in the lounge room, and I was quite happily sleeping in my room, but I remember coming down and everyone was mucking around and they were having breakfast and they were a bit bored, so they decided, okay, well, we'll see how many times we could all bench press bench press little old Josh, as I was 11 or 12 or something. So they're sort of bench pressing this little 30 kilogram, 25 kilogram little old me. Yep. I thought it was great, up and down and all around sort of thing. But I guess that sort of highlights the difference, There's my sister having a cocktail party for 18th and I'm being bench pressed by people. So it kind of tells it tells the age gap pretty succinctly, I think.
Okay. And then from a parenting perspective, so, when you reflect back on the time in that household, with your siblings and your parents trying to obviously manage, the expectations of 4 different kids. Was it ever very difficult from that perspective? Did anybody ever complain? Any of the siblings were like, you love Josh the most, or all that sort of stuff? Or
yeah, a little. We had an interesting dynamic at home. Again, a positive one. But so when I was born in 91, and just around about that time, so Dad was a roof tiler by trade. He left school at 15 or 16, and he went into roof tiling as his brothers did and his dad did, and I'm pretty sure his dad before him. Dad came over from England in 74 as an 11-year-old.
Yep.
And Mum's family's been in Australia for donkey's years. But so Dad went into the family business and that was sort of going okay anyway. Sort of things fell foul and sort of business broke down and they got into a fair bit of just financial difficulty really. And Mum was a nurse, so she was working night shifts and so Dad basically went back to school. So he went to TAFE and finished his HSC and then put himself through university. So the first probably 10 years of my life, Dad was studying and Mum was working nights or evenings and looking after us during the day and staying at grandparents' places and all of that. And that was an interesting dynamic itself. I didn't know too many of my friends that had that sort of reality. So I remember when Dad got Dad trained as a teacher. So he did his honours and got halfway through a PhD and then decided, so he studied analytical chemistry.
That's very different from roof tiling.
Very, very different from roof tiling. I've no idea how he discovered it, but I think when he did the HSC at TAFE, he realised he liked the science, then did a Bachelor of Science, and then it kind of went from there. So he got published in the Royal Agricultural Journal or something. He did his honours thesis was on metalloids in roof insulation or something like that. So there's the roofing link, I guess. But yeah, so then he went back to school, and so he got halfway through a PhD and kind of. I think he realised that there probably wasn't too much money in analytical chemistry when he got 4 kids and a mortgage in Sydney. So he became a teacher. So I still remember when he got his first job at a school that he's still at. He's been there for 20, 25 years now.
Wow.
And I remember the shift of that, so growing up, Mum a nurse, nurses aren't the best paid people in the world and Dad's putting himself through uni. So that dynamic itself was, challenging and difficult and growing up thinking baked beans on toast and spaghetti on toast a couple of nights a week is pretty normal. I often joke with people whenever I eat a steak, I sort of go, don't have the conditioning to chew meat that's this kind of real. So
the jaw's getting sore.
Yeah, that's it. And so all that was kind of that was sort of going on in the background.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm sort of sporty and, I was hours out the back kicking the football around the backyard or the front yard and we had this old 5-row garage in the backyard, and by the time I was probably 12 or 13, I'd kicked the footy into it that many times. There wasn't much of the outside walls of that left remaining, much to my dad's frustration. Whereas, and so I remember having that memory of a lot of afternoons, into the evening as the sun's going down, just being out there alone, kicking the footy by myself or practicing my baseball. I played baseball up until I was about 12. So, so that was kind of the dynamic of just being that little bit sort of different. But I think my parents were pretty caring and nourishing of all of us in the midst of that. Like they handled that really well. That they would often tease me about, sort of being Dad's favourite and that sort of stuff. But I don't think that was really that clearly the case. I think it was common interest versus some other things. But yeah, so I think Mum and Dad, they were really good in how they held that dynamic. In what would have, looking back now as a 32-year-old, my life's probably different from most people, but I know from friends and just being around, knowing the pressures that they're going through, some of my friends who have got kids and trying to manage all that it is complex. And the complexities of their life in the midst of that, of Dad studying, Mum working nights and all that goes with that would have been pretty challenging. But the way they did that was really amazing. Yeah.
Okay. And then so were your parents quite religious from that perspective? Like, were they very faith-based in how they approached life?
Yes, it's really interesting. So mum grew up Catholic. So I think her mum died when she was 18. So my maternal grandmother died in 1980, so it's 11 years before I was born. So, but she was pretty into the faith, and then her father, so my grandfather, he was a Vietnam vet, so he fought in the Malayan emergency and then in Vietnam, and so obviously the war was hard, and then losing his wife, he kind of grew distant from faith, and that was a difficult thing for my mum. But on the flip side, Dad was from a Church of England family, who coming over from the UK. I think his couple of older brothers got baptised, and then after that my grandparents just sort of forgot, I think, to get it all organised. So Dad and I were actually baptised together, so we were both baptised at the Easter Vigil in 1991, which obviously I don't remember, but there's a special thing in that for me as I think back on that, and even when I come to the Easter Vigil every year, I think about that Dad and I share that something special. And so I grew up going to church every kind of weekend, and Mum would be kind of quite open about her experience of faith and her own take on things, and Dad a bit more sheepish about it. Like I would sometimes have some conversation that sort of developed more as I've gotten older and gotten into what I'm doing now. But I think what I've realised with my dad is that he's got a really deep faith, and he went through something when he decided to convert, to get baptised and enter the church. I think he went through something really significant and profound, but something that he often doesn't talk too openly about, I think. So it's sort of in that way. So we'd go to mass most weekends. I altar served. I went through the sacraments. A little bit less during my high school years. I would take myself to church a bit more. But then in the last 10 years, Mum and Dad have had a bit of a reawakening of that. They did the Camino across the top of Spain in 2014, and that's kind of stir that up again in them. So they're back to sort of going to mass pretty regularly. So not overly devotional. Like we never did the whole rosary before, or rosary as a family of the evening. We'll pray grace before meals every so often and little things like that. So we were around, but it wasn't necessarily something we was kind of thrust into in a really kind of intense sort of way.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and to digress a little bit from the story of your upbringing at the moment, but, we sort of look around at society around us, right? And it would probably seem that, especially in Western societies, that faith is probably on the decline. I don't have the exact numbers, but I'm pretty sure, when you look at the numbers, it has been declining as, there's this sort of rise and a push towards what we'd probably call secular society, But I thought, when I think about it, I always find it very interesting from the perspective that a lot of what informs our laws, our government, and all of the, our morals in life is all actually taken from a faith-based context, So it's like, if you think about it like the evolution of something, it's like when something evolves, sometimes we forget the reasons why it happened, why it began in the first place, So as an example, you might look at a lizard and go, okay, let's have a look at this lizard, and it's evolved so that it can shed its tail to avoid predators or whatever the case may be. That has a very simple sort of understanding as to how we can sort of link it, right? And we can sort of link the correlation and the causation with each other. But then you go and take away some of these things, whether it's we'll try and not get too political with it yet. I'm sure. Yeah, we'll get into that. But I think for most people, it's right. It's pretty hard to avoid any of the heavy topics because that's where there's the most sort of delineation between how people approach it, right? So, abortion is probably the most prominent one that comes to mind. Whereas, if you were to ask somebody, is it okay to kill somebody else? Everybody would say no. Yeah. But then we get into this weird sort of world where, okay, well, a fetus is not a person. Well, not a person yet, right? That's like saying, okay, you're not an adult yet, so is it okay to kill you as a 2-year-old? People would be even more disgusted, right? It's abhorrent, right? But it's a very interesting world that we currently live in, where we're looking to try and grow in this sort of secular society, or as society sort of tries to push us more towards the secular end, and trying to take, I guess, some of the good teachings that religion gives us, but then trying to discard the actual religion in itself. Yeah. I'm a little bit curious on if you've got any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's the fascinating thing is, and it's exactly kind of what you're saying, is that you've got this foundation which very much is kind of built on Christian ideas, and they've what's sort of been prominent in society for 17, 18, 100 years or so, give or take, a couple of hundred here and there, but the reality is it's sort of, it's the whole idea of the frog in the boiling kettle. You put a frog in boiling water, he's going to jump out pretty quickly, but if you put him in lukewarm water and slowly raise the heat, he's going to get used to the temperature of the water. I'm not saying Christian values are going to burn us to death, but the idea of basically that we've become so accustomed to them, and it's sort of the water that we're swimming in and we don't quite realise it. A fish doesn't know that he's in water, a fish just knows that he's a fish, right? So and so like a classic one would be, say, equality. So this whole idea of this push towards equality. Well, the very heart of that is this whole idea of the dignity of the human person, that everyone is equal. We would say everyone's created equal. They're created bit maybe is up for debate in society. But, if you go back to, say, ancient Greece or ancient Rome, the periods of time immediately before the advent of Christianity is a world, at least in the West, a west-wide sort of religious ideal that impacted how we view the world and ourselves and our place in it. That if you're in Rome, if you're not a Roman citizen, you have zero rights. No rights that you're afforded. If you're a slave, you have maybe a little bit, but if you're not even in the Roman Empire, if you're not a Roman citizen, you're actually afforded very little protection under the law, you have very little rights. So how you're viewed as a human person is completely different. So this whole idea of that we're all equal, and this idea that we have human rights and we all should have equal rights, it's profoundly Christian. There's a really interesting book called Dominion by Tom Holland. He's the host of The Rest is History with Dominic Sandbrook, fantastic podcast. And his whole thing is basically this book. It's about, it's probably 700-800 pages. And his whole idea is that the world we live in now is built on Christian ideas. I'm pretty sure he still is. He says he's an atheist, like he has a whole lot of respect for Christianity. He's on his own journey. So he's not saying this trying to defend faith and really push people in. He's saying, look, in my study, I've just come to see that so much of even atheism itself is built on Christian ideals. And that's something we can't really get away from. We can pretend it's not. And, the abortion question's a classic one where we're jumping around trying to find logical, rational arguments around from this basic principle that we shouldn't kill. Because we accept that's actually a fundamental tenet of what it means to be a human being, but it hasn't always been so. But we're not quite able to recognise that.
Yeah. I was actually doing a podcast with another mate, and we were talking about, how religion or I guess, a belief in a higher power informs our daily lives. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reflecting on this topic was that what delineates human beings from animals, because I guess at the end of the day, without any sort of morals, we would be no different from animals. If it meant that, we could kill indiscriminately because we just kill to eat, if it meant that we are happy to, steal from other people and, procreate with whoever we choose to procreate with, like there is no difference between then being human, so to speak, and being an animal, if we're okay with, taking from other people and basically, just doing whatever it takes to survive, right? Because that's all we're programmed to do is survive, then there is very little distinction between us and animals. But then when, part of, I guess, the conundrum is that then if we have this ability to create things, we have this ability to reflect on things, philosophize on all these different aspects of what being human is. In essence, it's, we're talking about consciousness, right? Like having this conscience or having this consciousness that allows us to delve into these issues, then, I think there's a certain level of responsibility that comes with that as well, right? It could be it's very easy to go and say, okay, well, yeah, like, perhaps we're overcomplicating life, right? And perhaps all that life should be is that we're no different to animals, and the goal of the game is to just survive, procreate so that our genes live on and we move on from this world. But then, a vast majority of people always have questions in life, and I feel like everybody will come to this point in their life, and, some people may not have gotten there yet, and others, have already gotten to this point where it's like, well, what am I doing all this for? For me, like I often bring up, I had this experience on a psychedelic drug, and that was one of the things that sort of, accelerated my spiritual journey, so to speak, because, I guess prior to this, to give you a bit of an understanding of where I'm coming from, is that my dad he's a Buddhist. And so my grandma was a Buddhist as well. So a lot of what I grew up with was like this Buddhist ideology. Chinese martial arts has a lot of Buddhist ideology, depending on the art, but a lot of arts, in China will have a Buddhist ideology, like a Shaolin style ideology inbuilt into that as well. And my mum, she's more like an agnostic. She doesn't want to offend any religion, so she'll just pander to whatever you say. Yeah, you're correct too. Everyone's correct. Like that's how my mum sort of approaches it. But there's deeper problems when you just start to think that everything is correct, because we all know that there are certain things which you can sort of phase in as true or not based on, okay, if they don't align, if there's no alignment in what they're actually talking about, then something has to be wrong, right? They can't necessarily all be correct in everything. Not everything can be true at the same particular point in time. So, when I had this experience, I went in with very specific questions about what I wanted to try and understand. And, I guess where it sort of took me was like, I went through this process of basically feeling like I lived and died many, many times. And, when you go through the first death, it's a little bit sad, okay, that's it. Okay, wow. Life's over just like that. And then you go through it again and you go through it again, and it just kept repeating and repeating. It's like, wow, this is actually quite painful. I feel like I've died like 10,000 times here. I'm still dying. And then I'll wake up again and I die again, and I wake up again and I die again. And it's like, okay, it's like Groundhog Day. and you go, wow, okay, this probably wasn't really what I was expecting to get out of this, right? And then, there's two ways that you can sort of come out of something like that. You can go, okay, well, does that mean that my life is meaningless, right? Because if all that happens is, in 100 years' time, I'll be dead, right? And we'll all be dead. All the current people that we know will probably be dead. And there'll be a new generation of people, working through a new generation of problems and different things. And, the state of the world will have changed or whatever, or may not have changed. But you sort of can come away from it feeling so insignificantly small that life would almost not be worth living, right? It's like, why do we even bother, right? And then, it's funny, like, when people talk about legacy, it's like, I've had people ask me that question before, what do you want your legacy to be? It's like, I'll be dead. What do I care about the legacy, right? Like, it no longer impacts me. I'll be free of this world, right? Theoretically, right? We're still debating on in terms of, what actually happens, right? But so there's that pathway that appears when you go through this experience of living, thinking about what it would be to live and die all these times, right? And even if you just were to think about your own genetic makeup, you've got two parents, okay? And then from your mum's side, she's got two parents, your dad's side's got two parents, and then you got 4 grandparents. And then you go, and you keep expanding up and up and up. And then you just, when you actually think about that, there is so many people's DNA that influence your own. Even if you just go back 8 generations, you go back 10 generations. And even if you go back 10 generations, you're still only talking 800 years, right? How long have people been around? Yeah. Right? So that's why it's like so easy to get caught up in this idea that, okay, well, yeah, like life is essentially meaningless. That's one pathway. And the alternate pathway is that, okay, well, there has to be a reason why we're here then, right? So the alternate pathway is that, well, life isn't meaningless. And I guess, the sort of conclusion that came to me was that, and so I got sort of like this perspective, I guess, from what God must feel, right? So if you're like this omnipotent, all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing sort of being, when people, as an example, when people want to curse you and say, oh, God, why have you done this to me? Why have you hurt this person? Or why is there so much suffering in the world? All these sorts of questions. It's like, well, reality is, you wait 50 years, 100 years, and those people are gone anyway, right? And so, that actually makes God sound like he doesn't care, right? And that's not actually the point that I wanted to make. But what I sort of came away from this experience with was that, like part of what that love that God gives us is that, there's a part of it where it doesn't actually impact him in terms of how he feels, whether we live a great life or we don't live a great life. But the person that it means the most to is actually us, right? That he loves us that much that he gives us a choice in terms of how you want to live life, how you want to approach life, the choices that you make, the things that you do, so that you can live a life that is full, right? And that was like, I don't know why, but it really clicked for me, like in terms of trying to understand what I guess God's love is. And, you know, I woke up from this experience and I was like, you know, tears in my eyes, blah, blah, blah. And I just furiously started like hammering down all these notes that I just wanted to reflect on. But I guess, you know, and I've sort of gotten a bit off topic by telling you that story, but I'm sort of curious about, you know, how you sort of view these sorts of things. And then after that, we can sort of wind it back again and go back through, you know, the rest of your journey. I know we got on plenty of tangents.
No worries at all. No, look, I think what what your experience in your story there highlights is probably, I think, something which is probably much more common than we assume in our world today. You know, I last year wrote a minor thesis, so a body of work about 16,000 words, and I was trying to look at, okay, what's the experience of what we call emerging adults, so young adults from about 19 to 29. So for Catholic emerging adults who have had some sort of faith experience, what's it like for them to sort of emerge into adulthood in the world today? And that was coming out of my own experience of working with a whole bunch of young adults. You know, I mean, I've been in the MGLs in the Missionaries of God's Love for 9 years. I've been working in youth ministry now for about 14 or 15 years. That's almost half my life of working. A lot of that was I was a young adult still, but, you know, working with young people, and then particularly in the last 10 years or so working with young adults and seeing a whole lot of people who had pretty clear, identifiable experiences of faith. But I look at them now and a whole lot of them, probably not the majority, but some of them have sort of walked away and are living completely alternative sort of lifestyles. So that was sort of the question I had bubbling away, and as I was walking through my uni and my study, and so I decided to look at this in a bit more detail. And I spoke a bit about saying, well, look, we assume that we're kind of sleepwalking into secularity in our world today, at least in the West. You know, in Australia is a classic example of that. We look at census data; it seems like it's a one-way sort of trajectory, and that, you know, I wrote about how the world's pronounced the burial rights of religion, so to speak. But when you actually look into the study, what you actually find is that there's a whole lot more openness out there than you might think. That young people are kind of going, okay, well, and not all young people, a lot of young people either make a decision for faith, or majority of them going the other way, making a decision against faith. But there's a pretty chunky percentage or group of young people who go, well, look, I don't think the traditional ways of belief is going to work. It doesn't really work for me, whether it's questions around discrimination or it just doesn't feel right or whatever it might be. There's sort of a rejection of those kind of hierarchical, external, authoritative sort of ways of viewing the world and faith. But then they look at sort of, the fact that, I'm just a blob, I'm a piece of, material that's going to live for 60, 70, 80 years and then kind of die, and that's it. It's kind of like the experience you were saying. And they look at that and they think, well, that's actually kind of flat. Like there's something kind of missing. It just doesn't feel right, and what this, so I looked at that and through the lens of a Canadian philosopher called Charles Taylor. So Father Chris, who's the parish priest here, he put me onto Taylor, and I tried my very best to read. He's got 900 pages of very, very dense philosophy. And so I looked at it through that lens, and he says, well, what we notice is that people are, not everyone, but a whole lot of people are haunted by transcendence. They've tried to do away with the transcendent and say, well, all we have is the immanent, that which is around us. But what we realise is that it feels like transcendence is just around the corner. That it's kind of just lurking there. We can't shake it. We can't get rid of it. We can't get rid of this feeling that maybe there is something more. And so then they've got secularism and unbelief and immanence on one side pushing them one way, and then they've got transcendence and belief and faith in the other. And what they find is that this is pushing in on them, and it's kind of like two big sort of stars coming in, and eventually what happens is they come together and they explode into supernova. And so what he says is that there's almost this nova effect, this supernova on a galloping spiritual plane. And as these stars, the star of belief and the star of unbelief, the star of transcendence, the star of immanence, as they come together and sort of collide and then explode, what emerges, particularly in the world that we live in now that has so much agency for the individual, like I said, my dad was a roof tiler, his dad was a roof tiler. That was kind of just the way it was. Whereas now, dad's a teacher, I'm a deacon, I'm becoming a priest, I was going to be a politician, I thought about being a teacher, I thought about being a PR strategist, and I did all of that within 3 or 4 years. So the options are just plentiful with this on what we can actually do. And so he says, in this world we live in, what happens in the Nova effect is because there's so much agency, our options for belief, the possible third ways that we might believe, are exploding. And in one sense, that helps us because it allows us to work out something which is going to work for us. But at the same time, when we look at what's out there, it's like going to all you can eat buffet and you've got a little plate and you think, oh, where do I start? I'm not really sure where I start. And what adds pressure to that is that the idea of our identity is something we live in a world which says, well, and it's not something anyone tells us this, but it's almost like it's the water we swim in. It's just what Taylor calls a social imaginary. It's just this way of being. It's not even a thinking. It's this deep felt reality that we just assume it's the way the world is. And so when it comes to forming and knowing our identity, we believe that, well, that's something that emerges from within. I can't be told it from a hierarchy or from an external authority. I've got to discover that. But in some sense, I've actually got to discover that on my own. And if I don't get that, if I miss finding that, I miss what it means to be me in the world. That I've got this small little time, this 80 years, say, and if I don't land on my identity in that, well, I can't get it from anywhere else, and my life is meaningless. So that's the pressure that puts on us when we're trying to find that. So you mix all that in together and you think, well, I'm a 21-year-old going to uni, I've had this faith experience, or I haven't had a faith experience, and I'm trying to find my way in the world, in a world that's so full of noise from social media and advertising, etc., etc. That's all very kind of cliche, but if you think about that, then it's this haunting experience. And I sort of wrote about that. That's a very, very long, short form introduction. It's hard to believe that is the condensed version, but and so that's kind of and that matches to what I've seen in my work. I mean, I've only seen a very small anecdotal reality of young people, but in the study that I did, there's a sociological phenomena that's out there as well. And I think that's what's facing a lot of people, especially young people in the world today. And they're told that, well, you either kind of believe, you're one of the 10, 15, 20% of your peers who believe in something and they're all a little bit crazy, or you should be in the 80% who just reject it and throw off the shackles of religion and go live this hedonistic life that is going to be always enjoyable and you're going to be happy. And then they sort of get into that and think, hang on a second, maybe I'm not quite doing it right because I'm not having that experience. I'm not finding it as enjoyable. It's not, it's not as freeing as maybe I've been led to believe that it should be. And so there's this sort of stuck in the midst of these realities, and I think that's something which I think a lot of people face today, and they don't really know where to go. Yeah. They go, okay, how do I make sense of that? And that's and the thing is that the more hedonistic sort of like, oh, whatever, throw the shackles off sort of thing, that's pressing in on you all the time. And they don't have the resilience or the knowledge how to handle that. And I think that's the tension and difficulty that a lot of, at least in my experience, young people are facing. Yeah. That's quite tangential away from maybe where we were. But
no, I think there's an innate sort of need for some form of spirituality, or whether it's some form of faith or hope. That's actually inbuilt in every single one of us, right? And if you just take away the idea that it will not be found in organized religion, as an example, then all that happens is people just redirect that energy into something else. Whether it could be climate change, it could be CrossFit, it could be yoga. Like they go and find something else to attach themselves to, and then that becomes like their religion. I guess if we think about the etymology of the word church, it's essentially just a gathering of people. Yes, I suppose when we use the word church, we typically use it in a more religious setting. But, if you take it, I guess, from the more literal sense, anytime you're going with a group of people, you're essentially forming a church, right? And so you can form these churches around different things, whether it's, jiu-jitsu or fighting or whatever the case may be, CrossFit, or you can find them, in church, like in an actual physical Christian church. So, that's one of the things I think, everybody actually, it's interesting that the way that you say it, it's like, there's this 10 or 15% that, are I guess, religious, so to speak. And then the majority is like the other 80% who sort of reject that and choose that hedonistic lifestyle. But if you were to go and ask, people that live that hedonistic lifestyle, are they spiritual? They're probably the first ones to tell you, yes, I'm very into spirituality and, and chakra and, my spirit stones, and I guess, sort of to be a little bit stereotypical, right? Like they will find a different form of spirituality.
Yeah,
and I guess,
and I think that's the thing that I've realised, and particularly my study points to the wall of work I've done, is that we think it's either this or that, but the vast majority of people are smack bang in the middle, where they're kind of stuck between both, and they're just trying to find their way in the world. Most people are really well natured and good natured, and they're just trying to make their way through and just figure out what the truth is, and that's and the truth is for them, so to speak. And that's what I've realised. Most people are just really good natured people. That they're really just trying to find their way, and they're just not sure how to get there.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the resultant things that I sort of gotten out of doing all these podcasts is that, like, I can sort of see similarities in a lot of people's journeys, and it's like when I talk to people, I can sort of see what checkpoint they're at, because I've had that sort of wide ranging ability to see how people have progressed through life, and when they share their stories, it's like, oh yeah, okay, that's that particular checkpoint, and everybody has. They're at a different stage in that journey, and that's why I love talking to such a wide range of people, is because some people have, to others they would have been the people that made it, right? And then but those people that have made it, they're still searching, they're still seeking, they're still chasing, right? And then there's the ones that have no idea what they want to do in this world, and they're just starting out on the journey, and like they're full of a lot of enthusiasm and motivation to try and do something, but what it is they apply themselves to, that's the bigger question. So I guess bringing that back to you as a child, I guess how would your teachers have described you? Like, what kind of a kid were you in school? Were you studious as well, or were you just more active, sporty, that kind of kid?
Yeah, like I had ADHD growing up. I still do, mind you, but and so I remember having a discussion with my mum probably 5 or 10 years ago, and we were talking about us sort of kids growing up, and Mum was like, "Oh, well, you had a learning disability," and I was like, oh, "How dare you say that? I didn't have a learning disability." We went back and forth, and I went, "Oh no, I did have a learning disability." And so my poor parents, I'd come home from school and I'd have about 15 minutes of homework to do, and 3 hours later I'm still kind of, not bouncing off the walls. I wasn't hyperactive, but I was much more inattentive. But they're trying to get me to sit down and do 10 minutes worth of homework was like sort of, it was just horrible. I pulled teeth, my poor parents. So I'm naturally pretty switched on, but I was really not overly diligent as a kid. I sort of would survive and plod along, and I was pretty aimless. Like I remember, when I was in high school trying to pick my subjects, and 9 and 10, you get to choose your 2 electives. And I had no idea what I want to do. I like cooking, I like Italian food, so there you go. I'll do food tech and Italian. That was kind of it. That was the depth that I thought about it. Yeah. I did 3 years of Italian, and I say to people I forgot it in about 3 minutes. But so I was pretty aimless, and that was part of just not really knowing much about myself, and often feeling that I had to sort of fit into other people's expectations as well, and a bit of people pleasing and things like that. So I wasn't overly studious.
Did they try and medicate you for?
Yeah, they tried. I mean, so I was on like Ritalin for a little while, and when I decided to take it, it was quite helpful. But I hated swallowing tablets, so again, my poor parents, I think they just gave up.
Yep.
Once I sort of hit high school, they thought, they didn't quite have to hold me down and,
force it down
my throat, but almost, so a little bit of that, but so.
Did you notice any difference being on, and the reason why I bring this up is because actually the last 2 podcasts I've done before this, both of those guys have talked about, being on Ritalin as kids.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I just found it very interesting. It was like it's more common than we think. And, one of the guys was actually saying, it's funny because he actually has just gone back onto Ritalin medication, and he was talking about how, when you're a kid, they throw Ritalin at you like it's Skittles. Yeah. But as an adult, like as a 30-year-old trying to get back onto Ritalin, he had to go through all the different drug tests and all these sorts of things to try and get
a lot of money. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, I don't think I was ever consistent enough in taking that I probably would have known the difference, I think. But it's very interesting. There's a whole bunch of friends of mine, particularly around here actually in Sydney, that have they've all been diagnosed with ADHD as adults, and sort of one after the other, a few have just sort of been diagnosed, and I'm sort of sitting there like this old grandmaster saying, "Oh, welcome to the club. It's great to have you here. You're new here. Let me show you how it all goes." But so that's been pretty funny. They're all kind of like, "Oh, I'm on this." I'm like, "Oh, yes, I've heard of that one before. Yes, here's my wisdom as a long time sufferer sort of thing." But it is really hard. Like I started the process in 2021 to sort of get back into seeing a psychiatrist and to sort of try and get back on it. Oh, it was just a nightmare. It just took months. Like I booked in and it was a 4 or 5, 6 month process before I could even get to see a psychiatrist. And so it was just chaotic. It's really kind of really crazy. But
yeah. Okay. So, going back to high school, so did you have any idea what you wanted to do when you finished high school?
Kind of. So it was it was interesting for me. Like I went through high school so my first year I started at a different high school where I finished. I did 1 year and I had a pretty rough time. Like I got bullied a little bit and didn't really feel like I fit in and didn't have friends that were kind of good friends to me. So then at the end of that year, mum and dad kind of figured out that things weren't working. So they said, oh, look, why don't you swap over to where my dad teaches. So I changed schools and that was kind of good. Like I sort of navigated a little bit better and, I discovered a bit more of a sense of humour but then I kind of used that to kind of sort of take the mickey out of people and be a bit of a class clown and just be pretty, a bit of a rat bag really. It's pretty dumb when your dad teaches at the school. You think you get away with everything, but you get away with nothing. It's I definitely wasn't that switched on to that sort of stuff back then. But so sort of each year I found I had different friends and kind of had small groups of friends and didn't really not that I didn't fit in, but I was just a bit shy and not overly confident within myself and, and I would have known at the time, but living with a whole lot of anxiety, social and otherwise, that I wouldn't have been able to put my finger on. It started developing sort of like things like panic attacks as I was getting into senior high school. So all that period of time all kind of coincided at the same time as me kind of rediscovering, or maybe just discovering for the first time the idea of faith. So my sister's now husband, boyfriend at the time, he started a youth group in our parish, so I started going to that. That happened for a couple of years and then it folded and we started another youth group. And as I was going through school, I was getting more and more kind of interested in the idea of faith. So by the time I got towards the end of school, so I was in year 12 in 2008, so that's the World Youth Day. It happened here in Sydney, so that's a week-long, big Catholic kind of festival really, and so there's about 500,000 people descended on Sydney, the old Barangaroo, and it used to be a big concrete slab. So, and that was really important to me. I met a whole bunch of people that are still kind of friends now, and met a volunteer organisation that I ended up spending a couple of years working with. And that was sort of blossoming at the time that I was finishing school. So I sort of thought, I wanted to maybe become a chef, and I did work experience a week, and I thought, no, that's too much hard work. And I thought, well, maybe teaching. I sort of liked working. I realised that I liked sort of youth group, and I liked working with young people, and I liked sort of explaining things. And I wouldn't have said that I liked teaching at the time, but just the idea of doing that was kind of attractive. So I'd applied. I did my HSC, got like a 67 or something. Which the great thing about at the time was not that great, but the great thing now is that people always expect that my mark would have been higher. So I always trot that out if I want a little compliment, and people going, "Oh, 67! I thought you would have got higher than that." So that's sort of a free kick I give myself every once in a while. But so I kind of did that. But then I thought, I wasn't super sold. So when I finished school, I actually decided to take. Well, it originally was just 1 year to go to move. I moved down to Wollongong actually and did a year of youth work, so volunteer youth work with
just bring that microphone up to you a bit more. Yeah, just because it's cutting in and out a little bit.
Yeah, like that.
Yeah. Bring it a bit closer. Bring it to the edge of the table.
Yeah,
might
great.
be easier. Yeah,
no worries. All right.
That's better. Yeah, so you did a year of youth work.
I did a year of youth work. So that was sort of going into Catholic high schools and running retreats and conferences and seminars. So that was when I finished school. So I kind of went into that not really. I'd sort of had applied to become a teacher, but wasn't really sold on that as a solution, really. Yeah.
So then, okay, let's go back a couple of steps. So when you did the work experience to be a chef, any stories from that? Like, was it just difficult, or was there something that happened that sort of really turned you off that profession, or?
Yeah, like I think a couple of things. Like it was just hard. Like I think I really didn't have much of an idea around, and the restaurant I was working at was kind of boring. Wasn't a big restaurant, and I just found the work just wasn't that enjoyable, and some of the characters, one of the chefs there was just a bit of just a bit of a difficult sort of character and just a bit of a loser, really. Not in a sense of like, you'd say, oh, you're a loser in school, but it's just like, oh, it's not that much of a nice sort of guy. Nice so yeah, so I thought, it was like, you'd work late. Like I'd walk home or get picked up, and I'd be going home at, 11:30 or 12 at night as a 16-year-old thinking, oh, what is this? This isn't overly enjoyable. So I thought, oh, well, maybe that's not quite sort of right. So and then that was what I transitioned into going, oh, well, maybe I'd be like a cooking, a food tech sort of teacher and that sort of stuff. So yeah, my interests back then were sort of quite different. I guess sort of different to what I'm interested in now, really. But it was just like, oh, maybe cooking, teaching would be kind of all right, and that sort of stuff. But
yeah. So it's pretty different sort of range of interests, right? Like there's the cooking and the Italian sort of stuff in high school, and then obviously the footy and the sport, and then and then how did that then become your little foray into the political world?
Yeah, and for me that's really interesting. Like in some sense, it doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah.
Like I think all that stuff was kind of rather latent within me, and I think I just didn't really know myself well enough. And the idea of me sitting down and reading a book was an absolute nightmare. The idea of getting me to write anything was a nightmare. Like I remember my first English exam that I passed in high school was my HSC.
Wow.
So it's a good time to peak, I guess. But and so I often talk about, I remember when I was 18. I just signed up to do this year's youth work, and through World Youth I'd met, the youth organisation called Youth Mission Team Australia, and then the Disciples of Jesus community that they were a part of. And from that they said, oh, well, why don't you come, you're signing up for this year. The first thing we do, we have a week conference, a Christian conference. So we went out to Bathurst to Stanley's College out there, and they had a week, with lectures in the morning and then different things, and had these night sort of rallies in the evening. And I'd been to some stuff like that before. It was the first time I'd really gone, okay, I really want to get into something like this. And I remember at the time I sort of had a time where people were praying with me, and I had this encounter with God and his love for me in a really personal way. And it was almost like that kind of just woke me up, in so many different ways. And what I mean by that is, so like, for example, I talk about, before all that happened, I was like, oh, maybe I like cooking, maybe I like this. So pretty quickly after that, I realised I loved history, and I still love sport. But I loved history, and I was really interested in politics and current affairs, and I started to be able to write well. For someone who, writing essays in, I remember when I was in grade 3, I got a special merit certificate from my teacher because I finally put spaces between my words. As a 9-year-old, that's kind of basic. So not coming in with a great track record, and next thing you know, I'm enjoying writing, and I'm enjoying using the English language really well and creatively, and that was all really new for me. And so I often talk about this experience, and nothing bad about my family and my friends from before then, but it was when I was 18, it's almost like that's when my life really kind of kicked into gear, that I sort of got in touch with myself in a bit more of a deeper way, and really got in touch with who I am and what I'm interested in, and really invested in almost just getting to know myself in a way, which in some sense is kind of sad that it takes 18 years to do that.
I don't think so. I think that's a very common experience. I actually have seen this bit of a pattern where it's like, when you're young, you've got your parents around you, or whether it's your relatives, whoever's bringing you up, and then you may be fortunate that you've got siblings. So you've always got these siblings around you, so it's very difficult to have any time to yourself to sort of work out who you are. And then as you get older, you find friends. And so, the sort of time that perhaps your parents don't want to spend with you, well, not that they don't want to spend with you, but like they might be invested in other things, and that allows you more free time to do the things that you want to pursue. Those things are generally hanging out with friends. You're going over to friends' houses, or you're playing with your mates, and you're doing that sort of stuff. And then, you sort of become a young adult, and, for some people, they might move out of home. But then when they move out of home, they just move in with other friends, or whatever the case may be, and they sort of use that as an opportunity to go out more, pursue their career, do all those sorts of things. But when it comes to actually just sitting down and doing nothing and just doing a bit of self-contemplation, there's only one or two things that happens when you're that young and you spend that time with yourself. You have a look at yourself in the mirror and you go, I fucking hate myself. Sorry for the language.
No, you're right.
Yeah, you like some people might say that, or other people might say, look, I need to do something, right? Like I need to make a change in my life, or whatever the case may be. I think it's a very confronting thing for most people as a young adult to actually just sit there and think about yourself and not have the capability to sort of distract yourself. Because I feel like, a lot of things in this world are all distractions. Whether it's we get so focused, and even schooling, right? We get so focused on schooling that, okay, this is going to set me up for my career. So you focus on schooling, and for some people, maybe they don't finish school, or they decide to go a different pathway, like and do an apprenticeship, right? And then you get so caught up in, okay, I'm now in this work environment, I'm working and I'm doing my vocational education or whatever the case may be, and you're already in the workforce, that you don't actually spend that time to just sit there, and think about, okay, what do I actually want to do with my life? A lot of us, we pick a career, like say as an example, like I was always going to do engineering, right? So because my brother did engineering at university, I thought I'll just do engineering, right? And I enjoyed the subject, and so I was like, I'll do engineering at uni, and then I got the marks to do law as well. So then I was like, okay, I'll go and do law and engineering. Like there was no other real thought process other than my best two subjects at school were English and maths. What are the two subjects that are most like English and maths? Well, engineering and and law, right? That was my thought process, right? And, I think, a lot of people, just don't actually spend that time to reflect on what it is that they actually want, and that's why, people will launch themselves into these corporate careers as an example. And then 4 or 5 years in, they burn out and they go, why am I doing this? And then whether they start their own business or they go and do other things, that's what people do, right? Whereas, and I think there's great lessons from going through that experience as well. That's why I say, there's these certain checkpoints where you almost have to go through that, because then it's like, at least you've explored that avenue, right? If you never walk the pathway, you'll always wonder what if. But once you've walked it and you go, yeah, I've walked a few Ks down this road, I actually want to turn around and head back. Then at least it's like you've gained that wisdom to go and say, okay, it's time to turn back and let's reshuffle our priorities. So, so when you've spent that time to, I guess, doing that youth work and volunteering in Wollongong, like, I guess, were there things that you sort of found out about yourself that, okay, I'm a little bit curious about two things. The first thing is that when you had this experience and then suddenly you're able to now, commit pen to paper and have this focus, what do you think was the catalyst for that? Like, had you already been searching for something and then it's just like clicked into place, or, you've just had this experience through prayer and then suddenly you've, gained like this skill?
It's easy to look back for me now, and time compresses, right, as you get further away from it. But I think for me, and obviously it's a gradual unfolding sort of reality, but it's really for me, like, it was just having that experience, and being open to the experience of God moving more freely in my life, and actually go, well, look, God, if you're real and you're interested in me, well, like, I want you to be a part of that, and, what I've been doing. I remember having this experience at the start of the year previously in February of my year 12 year, thinking, man, stuff isn't working and I'm all over the place and I'm trying to do all these other things and trying to, maybe be who other people expect me to be. I'm sort of getting lost in myself in all of that. Sort of going, well, look, God, this isn't working. Almost crying out and saying, well, God, how do you see me in the midst of all of that? And that was sort of, for me, that was a real first time of actually having some sort of an encounter with God, of God just sort of going, hey, look, man, you're all right, and I've made you and I've created you, and definitely wasn't as succinct as this, right? But but I just love you for who you are. You don't have to tick any other sort of boxes. All you have to do is be yourself, and that's what really matters. And it was sort of from that moment and that experience that things started lining up. Within a month, I'd met Youth Mission Team, I'd met the Disciples of Jesus Community, the Cross and Icon had come. Father Chris had come to my school back when he was probably my age now, which is really weird to get my head around. But we found a photo of that the other day, and I sent it to Chris, and he said, "Oh, I remember that school and that place," and which is very kind of weird and very funny, but. All of these things started lining up. Like, I could actually tangibly see God's hand in my life, pretty much, and that's surreal even just to think about now, just seeing how blessed I was in that period of time, And so then I fast forward to that following January, that conference, and so I go, well, look, I've had this experience so far in this last 12 months, and my life's kind of changed. I'm kind of all in at this point, like, I really want to give myself over to that. And then having that experience, and then basically I went home for 2 days and then went off to Wollongong. I just turned 17 turned 18 during that week, so I was sort of very young, finished school. And for me, I think part of that is, and that year that I did, that turned out to be 2 years of volunteer work, a key part of that, you're praying every day and you're going to mass every day, you go to church every day, and you're making space, you know, and you're talking to young people and you're walking with young people and mentoring them, you know, and I'm just turned 18, what have I got to offer the world, right? But in that, I guess, is exactly what you're saying, there's space. And part of that is space to, you know, space to pray and to listen to maybe what God wants to say to me. A big part of that is space to listen to myself and go, well, who am I and what am I doing and what am I interested in? And I think it was that journeying together, like God walking with me through that, sort of accompanying me on that journey, you know, and just slowly unfolding some of that and going, well, this is actually who you are. And me actually going, hey, Josh, this is actually who I am, you know, and just going, oh, I like that, I like this, and I love that I'm into that. And, you know, I didn't really enjoy that, you know, maybe I should just let that sort of stuff go. Yeah. And little things like that. And I think that was and so I ended up doing 2 years, you know, so I'm 18 when I start. By the time I finish, I just turned 20, you know, and so there's that 18 to 20 is a big sort of period of your life anyway. So I was so fortunate to have that time, you know, and they were 2 good years. You know, the second year was quite difficult. I had a lot of difficulty just within myself and relationships and some of the dynamics of the group I was with. But regardless of all of that, like I looked to where I was when I finished that 2 years, and it's not quite chalk and cheese, but it's hard to see how I would have gotten to where I was without that experience, that formative experience of sort of having those people around me to really push me and to challenge me and put me out of my comfort zone and and that was my thing. I hated being hated being uncomfortable. I still do. I hated you know, really not putting pressure on, but really pressing myself and really I'm pushing myself to sort of, you know, try hard. I'm very by nature, I'm very minimalistic, you know, and so to be in that environment which really pushed me and challenged me was just a real godsend, you know, pardon the pun, but it was just great. That's what really helped me to sort of take those big strides, I guess, in those early years.
Yeah, I think that's most people, right? Like I think there's only really 2 motivators in life. It's either pain or pleasure. Yeah. Right, and sometimes, you know, we do what might be good in the short term at the cost of the long term. You know, it feels good in the present moment, but will it feel good, you know, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, you know? And it's like, oh, well, you know, some people will use that analogy, oh, life's short, you know, you don't know what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years' time. But at the same time, I feel like there's a real sense of achievement when you can invest in those long-term goals, you know, and when you, like, I guess it's like almost like, you know, building brick by brick, right? As you slowly build this structure, like you don't really know what the end product's going to look like if you just start with, you know, actually just laying down the first brick, right? And then you put all these bricks together and then suddenly you've got this house. Like I feel like that's, it's a bit of a checkpoint, you know, like that is definitely a checkpoint that people go through is like most people in their lives, they will go and establish some goals quite early on, you know, especially when they become a young adult, they'll go, okay, these are the things that I want to achieve. And then once you get to that and you achieve that, I think the next part of it is interesting because, you know, from my own experience, it was like I achieved this really big career goal of mine. And I've talked about it many times, so I'll spare people the story. But essentially, you know, once I achieved this goal, it was like I thought it was going to change my life. And perhaps maybe it was because of this expectation that it was going to change my life. It didn't change my life one bit. And I was a bit disillusioned after it. You know, I felt like I sort of sold myself short, you know, like, oh, is this all it was? And so then I was like, oh, you know, I didn't really plan for any steps beyond this. So that was a very interesting sort of conundrum to be in, right? And then it's like I can see where people then get caught up in the materialistic because then it's like, okay, you got yourself to a really good position in life. You're making lots of money. You know, what better way to force you to keep working hard than to spend it, right? You spend your money, you buy things that you don't need or that cost you a lot of money, and then you want to keep working to try and make more money to pay for those things and so that you can buy more things. But then it's like, for what? You know, why do you need all these positions, right? Like I really personally feel very torn between, you know, I guess, you know, how the world is in terms of like this consumerist, materialistic mindset, and then like almost having like this monk side of me where it's like I can do away with most things, you know, as long as I have the people around me that I love. Yeah. And, you know, we've got a roof over our head, we've got food, you know, those sorts of things are the most important things in the world. So, you know, but yeah, like that's one of those checkpoints where it's like when you reach that sort of a goal, it's like, okay, do you keep pushing for the sake of pushing, or do you actually take stock and evaluate and go, okay, well, what does it actually mean? Like if this didn't bring you any value or joy, so to speak, then what will, You know, is there something else that will actually fulfill you? So how did that then translate into you getting into the whole political side of things?
Yeah, so it was really kind of interesting. I did my 2 years down in Wollongong, and then I came back and I started uni, so I started studying a theology degree. I thought, I'm really interested in this sort of stuff and I want to take my faith seriously. But at the same time, and I remember the 2010 federal election, and that was the first time I started to really be interested. I'd be reading the news, and I remember a friend of mine asking me for advice on voting, and it was the first time I remember anyone asking me that, and I thought, well, as I look back, I think, well, obviously I must have shown some sort of an interest if people ask me what to do, right? And so it was after that, and then I was settled back in, and I was settling back into. I moved back to Campbelltown, and I was studying, and I was working in a high school around the corner as a youth minister, and then I remember sort of out of nowhere, a girl from the youth group, her dad was announced as the local candidate in the election, you know, and so he was running for the Liberal Party. Campbelltown at the time was on a 17% margin. You know, so it's a long shot. I mean, that was the sort of Julia Gillard was sort of the Prime Minister. She was kind of on the nose, and Christina Keneally was the Premier here, and the whole New South Wales Labor thing, and Eddie Obeid and Joe Tripodi and all that sort of stuff. So anything was possible, but everyone sort of thought, Campbelltown's still kind of a bit of a long stretch. Anyway, so I said, look, you know, I'm interested in politics. Can I help out on the campaign in some way? You know, the guy, Brian's a nice guy, lovely guy, and I thought, okay. And so we went back and forth, and eventually the last week of their campaign, they said, look, come down on a Wednesday, pick up your T-shirt for the weekend, and then we'll chat. So I got chatting with the campaign manager, a great guy called Rob, and Rob said, look, we're going to walk around the local shopping centre tomorrow. Come along, come for a walk, and all that sort of stuff. And then sort of spent the next day, went out in the evening, and we just walked around the big sort of shopping centre in Campbelltown, and got chatting with them, and they were lovely, and we got on really well. And then, I spent the Saturday out on the voting booth all day, handing out how to vote cards, and, you know, the classic sort of cutting your teeth in politics, you know. And anyway, and then he won. He won the seat. He had a 20-something% swing, and wow. It was quite unexpected. And you know, I think it was the highest seat on the pendulum to fall. It wasn't the biggest swing, but in terms of what the seats that the Liberal Party won that night. You know, and I remember sort of going and thinking, this is awesome. We had the party and that sort of stuff. This is amazing. Anyway, fast forward a couple of weeks, and then he met Brian messaged me. He said, well, come for a coffee. You know, you've spent a bit of time with us. I'd love to. Anyway, so I rock up to the office, and they're very kind of like, who are you and why are you here? And Brian's like, all right, we'll go for a coffee. And anyway, we're just chatting and talking about church and other things. And he said, well, do you want to come work for me? You know, just casually, 1 day a week, 2 days a week. I was like, I won't say no, you know. Yeah, bit of money, you know. You know, working, you know, I was, you know, entry level, you know, $28, $29, $30 an hour is pretty good. So anyway, I walked back and Brian said to his secretary, Josh is going to work for us. And she was like, is he? You should have asked me about that anyway. So she was a bit sort of cold to me at the beginning. And that's just sort of how it started. So I just started working part-time for him and getting involved just in his work and travelling around the electorate with him and answering phone calls and writing letters for him, and I'd go into Parliament. It was awesome. You'd put your suit and tie on, and you'd go in and you'd sit in the gallery and sit in his office, and he'd be down there making votes or making speeches, and you're bumping into the premiers, you know, in the lift. You're in there with Barry O'Farrell and that sort of something. Oh, hello, how you going? And very surreal as a 20-year-old. You're thinking, what am I doing here? And that's sort of how it began. So from there, it was sort of like, I was sort of hooked like a drug, right? It was just really it was exhilarating, and it was high octane, and there was a great level of detail that I really enjoyed. And what I realised is I had natural gifts in politics. So I've got a pretty natural gut. Like if you announce a policy, I can kind of look at the demographics and get a feel for the area and tell you just how it's going to go, whether it's going to be good or bad, and how you're going to sell it. You know, so really about looking at how we can communicate things to the local area. You know, just developing a good knack for you know, good prudential political judgment, and just analysing policy and just a feel for how political realities will unfold. And so that all kind of emerged. So I realised I'm actually kind of good at this thing. So I did that for a year, and then moved to Canberra. I got in a relationship, moved to Canberra for a few months, and that kind of didn't really work. But I'd shifted. I changed to studying politics. So I went to ANU for about about 5 minutes really. And then after a few months, the relationship broke down. And we're still on very good terms. I'm good friends with her and her husband, and anyway, we came back to Sydney, and then thought, no, I think this politics thing is something I really want to pursue. So I was studying at Notre Dame in the city, so I went back, did a politics and international relations degree, and just said, okay, no, I really want to focus on this. And so I was working part-time and picked up another job sort of sporadically at another MP's office, and started working on any political campaigns I could work on. Had a big gig in the 2013 federal campaign, sadly with the guy who couldn't remember the 6-point plan to stop the boats. So I was kind of the assistant campaign director for that, and it was a bit of a nightmare, but it was great. I remember going and being handing out how to vote cards with Don Perrottet, and just chatting with him and different sort of politicians and all that sort of stuff. So that was sort of just my kind of bread and butter, and it was really addictive. I really loved it and made some really good friends, and it was great. And I thought, oh no, this is, I think, I remember thinking, this is kind of what I really want to get into.
Did you have any bad experiences? Obviously when you're on the street talking to people about politics, it's not the most well-liked subject, especially around election time, because people have generally, come to some sort of conclusion. I can speak from experience on this because I ran in the last federal election as a Senate candidate as well. So, when people would sort of just judge you based on, a party, so to speak, and not really want to entertain who are you as a person, even though, they have the opportunity to vote for you directly as a person, right? I found that very interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I definitely had moments, there were periods of time where, some people were a little bit nasty, but on the whole, I found most people were pretty good. One thing I loved about election day is that, and it's probably gotten a little bit worse now, which is a bit disappointing, but I used to always make sure I'd go and chat with, so I was working for the Liberal Party, so I'd go and have a chat with the Labor candidates, the Labor workers and the Greens workers, and to say, hi, this is who I am, and ask them a bit about them. And by the end of the day, we'll be sort of having fun, and, you get to about 3 or 4 o'clock, it's sort of the dead time on polling booths, right? And you're like, oh, okay, well, you've got to work this word into your little spiel as someone's walking past, as you hand the card to them. And I think that was, and I naturally kind of want to bring people together. I've got a bit of a synergist sort of bit about me, and I like sort of building bridges and relationships. So, I always try to sort of carry myself really well. I'd get frustrated, but often just trying to internalize those things, and it never works anyway. But that's a whole different story. But yeah, so I definitely had some moments. We had some people just come and they give you an absolute serve. But for the most part, I just remember having really positive, particularly of when you're on the pavement, you're door knocking or you're doing all that sort of stuff. It just lots of really fun, lots of long days, and lots of those things. Oh, this is so boring, and I'm a bit over it. But just getting to meet and hear people's stories. Remember, I love that part of just going, well, tell me a bit about your story. What matters for you. What's really important for you. And some people go like, oh, you and your mates have got no idea, and you're out of touch. And my politics has changed a little bit these days, so they're probably right. But yeah, but I remember 2013. That election was really hard. They'd asked me, said, look, would you like to work on the Greenway campaign? They need some support. And I was kind of angling for a job in Canberra. I'd been working in state politics, and my plan was, look, if I can, I've got about a year to go at uni. If I can, throw myself into a campaign, prove my worth, get an electorate office job, and then that could be a springboard to Canberra. And then if I can do that and then move into a ministerial office, that'll be a good step up. So I had this sort of plan. So they said, well, I thought, well, Greenway, it's the most marginal seat in the country, and it was great. And it was really a really interesting thing is that, so James Diaz was the candidate's name, and on the first day when they announced, okay, the campaign's actually starting, he had 3 interviews. So one with Channel 9, one with Channel 7, and one with John Hill for Channel 10 News. And the first 2 went off without a hitch, and then the third one, he just got stuck, and he didn't present super well to media, which is just, that's part of cutting your teeth in politics, and people are just putting their hand up and having a go, right, and John Hill was a great interviewer. He's kind of cutthroat, and once he sort of had the sniff of blood in the water, he went for it, and that's he's doing his job, so there's no no ill will there at all.
Yeah.
But I remember they said, oh, look, we had 3 interviews, one wasn't good, and I was at uni, so I remember coming back to the campaign office and watching it. And I remember, I was 22 at the time, so, a whole lot of, unprocessed ability of, and an inability to process emotions. I remember just throwing a water bottle in frustration, thinking, oh, no. And then I thought, oh, this is just not good. And then that was it, and that was the really hard thing, is that we'd done a whole lot of good work. And James had done a whole lot of good work. He'd been out door knocking and all of that sort of stuff. And he was a lovely guy. And I remember just thinking, oh, this is, surely we can't lose. And, then we had a handler come from headquarters and all that sort of stuff. And then I remember election, I remember being, and I'd organised a third of the the polling booth sort of staff and all that sort of stuff, my mates out there. And I'd spent 30, 40 hours a week on this campaign for 3 or 4 months. And I thought, if I will win and it'll all be over, it was a hard campaign, but we'll get to, I'll get to Canberra, I'll get a job. And he had one, I would have had a lock on a full-time position. And then I remember being there at the office on election night, and I'd written an Excel, like I'm not great with Excel, but I'd written an Excel spreadsheet and put all of the previous year's data, and I'd worked out all the formulas so that it would tell me, what the swing was booth by booth. And so I was the guy, so I was getting all these text messages and I was running them through. And I got 3 booths in, and I knew we'd lost. And that was only about 2% of the vote, but it was big booths that we needed to win.
Yep.
And I thought, no, there's no way this is the trend here. We're going to buck that elsewhere in the electorate. And so I knew at about, so that was about 7:15. We didn't concede until the next day, but I just knew. And I just remember crying. Like, I was just so distraught. I put hours and hours of effort in. And I remember calling a mate of mine, and he was like, this minister, this federal minister knows the work you've been doing, and this state minister knows what you've been doing, and just think about your name. You're getting your name's getting bigger in the party, and I don't know if any of that was true. I don't know if anyone knew who I was, but I just remember just being so disappointed, And I remember Mum just messaging me on election night and saying, you put in a whole lot of good work. Even now, just talking about it, I just think, it's a really sad. So I'm glad we didn't win. Otherwise, my life would have taken a very different direction. Okay. But. I remember that standing out, being that particularly difficult time, of just seeing, of having known the highs of elections when they go really well, and being in the Liberal Party, that was a big win. Abbott comes in and he wins a big swing across the board, so all my mates are celebrating, and I'm there in the foulest mood because I'm like, this sucks, and seeing them all, and I'm like, well, I'm celebrating for them, but just knowing the. All this work that I'd put in had sort of come to naught. Yep. But I'd learn a lot through it. I think that was the main thing, and it was sort of something that I think that pointed into the future of just being able to see. And I look back now and seeing all these little things of where, not that little doors were closing, but just noticing that some of it was just too much of an uphill push. As I was trying to make my way in the political world, too many doors were kind of not really opening, or it was too hard to push through in certain things. Yep. And just seeing in that, well, maybe this isn't quite where I'm meant to be going.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because I think, a lot of times in life, when we encounter resistance, right, there's 2 ways that we can approach it. We can either go, okay, well, I guess that's not meant to be for me. Or the alternative is like, people keep pushing and they push, and then at some point, perhaps they do get through to the other side and they get to what they want. It's a very interesting thing to think about, because there is no right or wrong in terms of how you approach that. But I guess everybody has to internalize, those lessons that they learn from that. For me, having gone through a federal election, and campaigning and all that sort of stuff, I thought it was a great experience. I came away with a lot of great friendships as well. And that's how I sort of looked at it, because, the position that I was in was untenable to win anyway. Yeah. It's a minor party, 5th on the Senate ticket. Yeah. Like, it's, it's not, there's no chance of winning.
And they're the fun ones. I remember the guy who ran the first campaign, his wife got bumped into running in a seat in 2007. So Kevin Rudd, was coming in, and the Labor Party already held the seat. So she just got a phone call saying, well, congratulations, you're the candidate. She's like, oh, okay. And they had the best time, because they just thought, we're not going to win, we're just going to go out there and meet a whole lot of people and have a whole lot of fun. And they loved it.
Yeah. And you see, you can have a great experience from that as well. Like, that was, for me, that was a lot of fun. And, when I decided to do it, it was one of those things, when else in your life are you going to do something like that, right? So... yeah, but it was one of those ones that also, made me reflect a lot in terms about how people approach politics. is really, negative perspective the moment that politics sort of comes into any conversation. And it's sad that it is that way, because the whole point of an election is to sort of contest ideas, and it becomes more about personalities as opposed to ideas. And it's one of those things, I guess, probably more in the current climate where it's pretty hard to differentiate between, the Labor and the Liberal Party on specific policies now, because they both just offer the same options. So that's also very difficult as well, when you're supposed to have two competing ideologies, so to speak, or two competing parties that are offering different solutions to the same problem. I feel like that's sort of gone by the wayside a little bit. And I find that to be very disappointing, because it's like essentially, if the only tool you got is a hammer, well, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
But the problem is that you're supposed to have two different ideologies here coming together with different tools, different ways of looking at it, to sort of offer, two different alternatives. But when they're both just espousing the same alternative, it's sort of become more like a monopoly than it has anything else. So
yeah, and I think that I look at the state election that just happened here, and I look at the positive way that both Dom Perrottet and Chris Minns kind of carried themselves in that, and I think it's pretty clear. I mean, Chris and Dom are both really deep thinkers. I mean, I don't know either of them. I mean, I've met Dom a few times, but definitely don't know him well, and I know people who know Chris, but again, haven't met him. But you can just tell from the ideas they put forward and that sort of stuff. They are deep thinkers. And then I think that was the fact that they're texting each other during the campaign, and they are presenting different ideas. And I think that was refreshing just to see that, okay, well, was it the best campaign at all? Probably not. And the cost of living crisis, and that limits the possibilities of what any party could really effectively campaign on. But I think just the way they carried that, and the way they weren't afraid to go, okay, well, this is what I think, and vice versa, going, well, look, the other person thinks that. I actually can see where they're coming from. I just don't think it's the best solution for us now. And I think that the positive press that got, particularly on election night, people saying, the way this has been a clean campaign, and how both of them made comment of that, and saying, well, this is actually a blueprint going forward, shows how much that's kind of been absent and is needed as well. And that's what's, I guess, that's kind of been the shining light in an otherwise pretty dark period politically, I think, in the country. So that's been really, and you look federally at the moment, they're not doing that. It's all a bit sort of mudraking and pretty gross. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so when these sorts of doors closed, how did that then lead into the idea of becoming a priest?
Yeah, so the priesthood had been around for a little while. Obviously the idea's been around for a long time, but in terms of for me, so I remember I've got fleeting moments here and there as a young guy thinking about it, when I was 16 and I was 18, and when I finished my 2 years in Wollongong, I had a really good look, and I reached out to the MGLs and to Father Ken, who was our founder, and we'd had some conversations, and I was like, I'm interested in this, fill out this application. I was like, okay, that's really quick, really all of a sudden. But I thought about it for a little while in 2011. I thought, oh, maybe not. And then that's when I got into politics, right? And I thought, no, I want to give this a really good crack. And then so I finished uni. I finished my undergrad. So I did a Bachelor of Arts in Politics, International Relations and History from the University of Notre Dame. And I finished that in 2014, and so my last semester there, I did an internship with sort of a PR firm that had a corporate affairs, public affairs, government relations kind of practice within one of the 6 practices in the firm, and had a really good experience. So I'd got my politics lecturer. He was a great guy, John Rees from Notre Dame. He's a phenomenal guy. I still keep in touch with him. Actually, he's just a phenomenal guy. He reached out to a friend of his and said, oh, look, I don't really normally do this, but, this might be a good option. And they said, look, we haven't taken an intern, but as a favour to John, we'll give you an interview. Anyway, he messaged me the morning of, said, oh, look, the guy who worked at the firm, he said, look, I can't be there, but the head of our corporate affairs team will do the interview today, but good luck, I hope you go really well. And I jumped on the train, and this is back before they had Wi-Fi or good reception in the city circle. And I remember getting out at Wynyard and looking at my phone, and Barry O'Farrell had just resigned. The whole range sort of bottle of wine thing had just happened. And so I walk into the interview, and a lady called Jacqueline, lovely lady, she says, okay, Barry O'Farrell's resigned, what happens? And that was my interview. So I said, okay, well, look, I think Mike Baird's going to become the leader. Gladys has got some support, but I think she'll come behind Mike. Gladys is probably a little while away. She'll eventually will run for the leadership. But I think in terms, you look at what the runs Mike's had on the board, he presents really well. His first 3 years as treasurer has been phenomenal. I think he's the clear favourite, and this is what I think. And this is the implication. This is how I think we'll back him. This is why it'll work that way. And then she said, look, I agree. And then I jumped on the train and got an email saying, look, we'd love you to come and to intern with us. And anyway, so that sort of happened. And then we got to the point of the 2014 budget. So Abbott had just been elected the September before, and they said, look, we just have a little project for you, because they were saying, look, we want to give you a bit of experience. So they said, look, we have 6 different practices in our firm, and they each covered 6 different areas, healthcare and retail and etc. So they said, we want you to go and to use your research skills, figure out what's in the budget. So no one's going to tell you. You've got to read newspapers, you've got to get online, you've got to listen to sources, you've got to get on social media, have a look around, look what's going to come, and then say what the impact's going to be in each of our 6 different areas. Anyway, so off I went and took a couple of weeks, and I wrote it. And I emailed it to the head of the practice, and right away she says, can you come in to my office, please? I thought, oh no, this is foreboding. And she just says to me, I remember it to this day, she says, the fact that an intern's written this is really hard to believe. We'll make a couple of grammatical changes, but your writing style and your analysis of the policy is spot on. This is phenomenal. And I was just like, this is awesome. And they were so good. They were such a lovely place to intern and work for. And anyway, so we got talking. And so I thought, that's kind of cool. I'm really enjoying this. So I said, well, why don't I? And one of them had done a master's at Sydney Uni. So she said, why don't you do the same master's? So I started a master's of strategic public relations at Sydney Uni. So here's me getting a 67 ATAR or UAI back in the day. And all of a sudden I'm doing a master's at Sydney Uni. I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. Anyway, and so that was kind of going along, and they had said, look, I'd finished the internship, but they were like, oh, look, I think we'll end up giving you a job. We've just got to find the money and the position. But in the meantime, I thought, okay, well, I kept going. A job came up with the Senator Bill Heffernan had a job going, big character, and I thought, okay, well, this would be a good opportunity. And I chatted with them and they said, oh, you should go for it. It's a good chance. So I applied, and a week before the applications closed, I got I applied on the Monday. On the Tuesday, I got a reply saying, look, we'd love for you to come in for an interview. I'm thinking, oh, that's really promising. But it was right about census day. It was a full-time job, so I thought, I can't work full-time and keep studying. So I decided, no, I'm going to pull out. So I pulled out of the Masters. And they went and interviewed, and I thought, I need to get new clothes. So I bought myself a Calvin Klein shirt and a Calvin Klein tie. And here's little me from Campbelltown, right? Julius Morrow shoes or whatever they're called. And I thought, I've got to, look the part. And I looked pretty good. It was great. But then I thought, I'm hungry on the way. So I grabbed a meat pie and spilled meat pie on my tie. And I'm trying to get meat pie. It was just an absolute comedy of errors. But anyway, I interviewed him. But he was a lovely guy and did okay. But anyway, I didn't get the job. But I remember walking out of the interview, walking back to the train station thinking, I don't know that I really want this job. And then all of a sudden there I am, no uni, and I'm only working part-time. So I had all this time. And at this time, I'm kind of still going to church, and I'm going every week and that sort of stuff. I was sort of wrestling with things around, my own how I fit in with things, and I was getting into I'd loved going out drinking with my mates and going to parties. And I remember one weekend getting really drunk, and I remember sitting at my desk. I'd already stepped down I'd already pulled out of uni. It's about maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. All this spare time, I'm sitting at my desk on a Monday morning, and I'd gone out Saturday night. I was still feeling pretty dusty on Monday morning, so pretty heavy weekend. And I remember just thinking, man, what am I doing? Like, this is just silly. Like, I'm not having a good time, and it was just dumb. Like, I was going from one thing to the next. I knew I just wasn't really happy, and I wanted to sort of sort myself out. So I reached out to a guy I knew from a church community and said, look, can I come visit you tomorrow? So I drove down to Wollongong, and we spent 4 or 5 hours talking. And he was like, well, you just need to figure out what you want to do. Is like, when you come to life when you talk about working with young people. The politics stuff is kind of good, and you're pretty good at it, but is it sort of what you want to be doing? And then I went away from there, and all of a sudden, it's almost like I'd had this reconversion that all of a sudden I had all this energy and desire to pray. So I started praying every day, and that's something I'd struggled with for years. So I'm spending half an hour praying every day, and then, all this sort of stuff's kind of happening. And then all of a sudden, about a week after that, I was reminded of the story of Abraham and Isaac, of Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son. And I was sort of, and the idea of the priesthood started coming up. And I thought, I thought I dealt with this, man. Like, I don't want to. And I had this thing, I was like, well, I don't want to have to. I felt like, if I have to keep coming back to this every year, how am I ever going to get married and be happy? Like, if this keeps coming back and sort of haunting me, sort of a thing. So there's a bit of a negative connotation to it, right? But and then the Abraham Isaac thing, and I remember I've got all my journals from that time, and I remember just seeing it, Abraham Isaac underlined, really sort of, scribbled under on the day. I remember I can see that was the prayer time. And anyway, more I thought about it, I thought, I think I need to actually really look at this again. And so I started umming and ahhing. And that was it. And there was interesting at that time is that I had all this motivation to just do stuff. Like normally I'd sort of be a bit reserved, going, I don't know if I want to put, I'd be a bit of a toe dipper. But I was like, I'm just going to jump in. So I just rang up, the MGLs in Canberra, said, I want to come and have a chat. So I drove down 3 hours down the highway, had an hour-long meeting and then drove home. Because I was like, this is kind of what's been happening in my prayer time, and I want to know if I'm meant to be a priest. And I was like, maybe not. And then I was arming and ahhing, and I went to and so at this point, I'd been talking to some people, like I'm wrestling and trying to get advice about what to do. So I went to this sort of Christian sort of formation training conference about how to pray with people and whatnot. And it was non-denominational. So you had Catholics and Pentecostals and Baptists and all that together. And there's this bit at the end where what they call a blessing service. And so in some of these circles, we have this thing, what we call the gifts of prophecy. And it's the idea that God will give you a sense about someone else and be able to speak something into their life that's going to be meaningful and help them in their journey of faith. And so I'm there, and it's the end of this thing, and this guy gets up. And I'm thinking, do I stay in politics or do I go become a priest? And this guy gets up and he goes, there's a choice before. I never met this guy before in my life. He goes, there's a choice before you. There's two paths. One path is a man in a business suit going the clearly marked path, 3 steps up and stepping into the light. The second option is the path less travelled, more something more earthy sort of clothing, and there's another 3 steps, but those steps are higher, and they're the higher glory of God. Choose wisely. And I remember looking at someone who I came with, who I'd taught a little bit, and his jaw just dropped to the floor. He was just like, what on earth? And that was just, and I thought, what on earth is going on? Anyway, and so I jumped back and forth, and eventually what I realised, and that within 2 or 3 weeks, I was like, man, I've got to give this a go. Like this has been coming up every so often. I love working with young people. I eventually decided to join the diocesan seminary, and then the last minute I changed and said, no, I think I'm meant to join the MGLs in Canberra. So February or end of January, I went down the road and joined in Canberra. And the interesting thing of that period is that in early August, my parents had gone, like I was saying, my parents did the Camino, and so my parents left in the middle of August. I was in politics. That's what I was doing. I was plugging away. And my parents, they're not sort of we want our son to be a priest sort of type. They were like, are you sure this is really what you want to do? I don't know. But by the time I'd come back, I said, I'm joining the seminary. So that's, 2.5 months. But realising that they were praying for me all the way through that they were really kind of walking with me in their own way as they were walking across the top of Spain, and they're praying for all of us kids, I think. Well, I'm sure they were. And I only realised that a few years ago, that it was basically from beginning to end, it was all sorted within that period of them being away, which is pretty amazing. So, yeah.
Out of curiosity, why did you decide to go with the MGLs?
Yeah, I mean, I ummed and ahed about that really. So, originally, so I met the MGLs. Well, I met Father Chris a little bit when I was in school, but that was a fleeting sort of thing. But in my time with Youth Mission Team, I'd really gotten to know the MGLs really well, and I'd been really attracted to their kind of charismatic spirituality, their way of praying, their work with young people. Particularly their way of life is, they live poverty and chastity and obedience, and they sort of don't really own a whole lot of stuff, at least for personal use. They've got a whole lot of stuff for ministerial use, but and so that was always there. But I had a really strong connection to home. Like I've always been very much one of my big sort of Clifton strengths sort of things is context. So the context from which you come is really important. And so for me, really being like anyone that I talk to, they always know that I'm from Campbelltown because I mention it in 5 minutes. I'll be like, how do you know someone's into cross training? They'll tell you pretty quickly. So, I'll tell people pretty quickly I'm from Campbelltown. I'm from the Wollongong Diocese, and I'm really proud of where I come from. And so that was a really big drawing card. And so I said, oh no, I think that's what I think. And then they just got their stuff together quicker in terms of the applications and that sort of stuff. So I just sort of started that process. And next thing you know, I was sort of, elbow deep into it. Oh, well, I've got to keep going. I've started the process. And then I remember I'd gone to that Christian conference that I talked about that happens every year. So I'd gone to the 2015 edition of it. And on the Tuesday of that day, of that conference, I got the phone call and said, oh, look, you've been accepted for Wollongong Diocese. And I remember hanging up the phone call and walking around and thinking, why am I not excited? I'd been bugging me a little bit, thinking, have I chosen the right thing? And I realised, man, if I'm not excited now, when I'm in the midst of it and it's all going really, really difficultly, I'm in trouble. I thought, but I can't. I'm stuck. I'm sort of, maybe in a year's time, maybe then I'll change. Because I realised, I really wanted to be part of the community and work with young people and be charismatic and be a travelling missionary. And so then I chatted with a guy, his name's Father Dan Serratori. He wasn't a priest then, but we caught up on one of the days and I said, look, this is what's going on, man. He's like, look, it's not too late, why don't you have a chat with Father Ken and then we can see what's possible. So now I've been talking to Ken through the process. So I said to him on the Thursday morning, I said, look, can we catch up at some point? He's like, why don't we have breakfast on Saturday? He's thinking I'm gone. He's like, I've let Josh go. It's all over. We tried really hard, but he's going a different direction. So we sit down there with our bacon and eggs and little sausages. And I remember we're in this meeting room, we're having, trying to eat our breakfast with our plate on our lap sort of thing. It's always a difficult thing. And he was like, oh, how's the summer school going? We talked about the school because I was helping to run it and all that sort of stuff. And then I finally plucked up the courage and said, oh, Ken, this is what's going on. And I told him everything. And he said, well, I think I'm meant to join the Missionaries. And he almost fell off the chair, the poor thing. But he was so gentle and pastoral. He said, well, why don't you come and join us? And that was it. And he just said, look, and we talked out what that would look like. And I remember walking out of that room and just thinking, oh, the big sigh of relief. And then I got home and I called the vocations director in Wollongong, who I'd been a priest I'd known for years. And I said, oh, look, I'm so sorry. I think I've got to withdraw. And another guy had done the same thing 10 minutes earlier. So he'd gone from 3 potential seminarians to 1 in the space of 15 minutes. But he was so good, a lovely guy. He said, look, I never really knew why you were looking at us in the first place. I was happy to take you. Like, I trusted your discernment. But I always thought you were always a missionary of God's love anyway. And so he's like, I'll give them all of the material, all of your psych tests. And so the MGLs were happy, $10,000 worth of psych tests they didn't have to pay for. So,
wow.
And that was it. So then I went down the coast and so Father Ken said, look, take a week, just pray about it and just see how you're sitting with it. I remember we were camping, my family and I were camping in Corrimal. And I loved Wollongong. I'd done my 2 years in Wollongong a few years earlier. And it was such a spiritual, we talk about spiritual thin places where heaven and earth are really close, and that's just like that. Walking along the beach in Wollongong is just sort of like one of my happy places. And I remember just walking along the beach and just thinking, I said, I think I'm going to do it. And the peace I felt was just so like, this is right. And then 2 weeks later, I was driving down the Hume Highway to go to Canberra. I remember waking up the first morning and thinking, what have I done? What am I doing here? But yeah, that's sort of how it came about.
So I'm a little bit curious about that. You mentioned the psych test, right? So obviously there's a bit of an admissions process. And part of the reason why I sort of, am interested in this is because I feel like, in any organization, so church aside, let's think about, where it's a workplace or whatever the case may be, it's the quality of the people that work in that environment that dictate how good that workplace is, and likewise, how happy the customers may be or the churchgoers, etc. And why I'm interested in that is because, I always find it very interesting when people are very quick to point out the flaws of any religion, right? So whether it's Islam, whether it's Catholicism, whether it's Christianity, like people are very quick to point out what are the bad things, right? That, the church has these scandals, or Islam has, has people that do these things, right? And that's what people will focus on first of all. And I find that it's a very interesting thing because I feel like it's almost like a deflection tactic, right? It's very easy to go and point at somebody else and go, oh, but you guys, there's, the negative things that happen, like child abuse is happening here, right? So they're very quick to point out something like that. But then it's like, okay, but what does that mean in terms of your own personal faith journey? Because that's a very different question to what are the flaws in the church. But I want to just talk a little bit about, the flaws of the church, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure.
And I found it, when you mentioned the psych test and things like that, like, is that something that's always been as part of the application process, or is that something more new?
I mean, the history of the church is probably pretty new. 500 years is pretty new in the history of the church in some ways. I would imagine, I don't know the hard and fast sort of facts on this, but I'd imagine it's probably something in the last 40, 50, 60 years, I would say, in terms of the psych testing. And it's a really important, it's not the whole picture. There's a whole range of different admissions things. I did do the dental test and medical records and all that sort of stuff, but I think it's a really important one. And there's a whole range of different tests that you do. So you just do a normal sort of, in terms of just your own psychological makeup and, things around anxiety, and you have to do a whole life history, and you talk about your medical history, and they talk that through with you. So it was a 2-day process for me. And then you do an abnormal, something around, looks at abnormal psychologists is looking for hints and symptoms of things like psychosis, schizophrenia, those sort of more intense abnormal psychological experiences. And then there's important particular focus on your psychosexual makeup and your own sexual maturity, and how you deal with some of those sorts of things. And they're quite extensive. The questionnaires that you go through, but they're quite thorough, and they're important too, because the intensity of the way of life, and obviously celibacy is a big deal, right? Like it's an important part of what it means to be a priest for different reasons, but it's a significant one as well. And so you've got to kind of be aware of that, of just the challenges that are present in that, as well as any sort of vocation as well. Psychosexual issues have flare-ups in marriages as well, so it's not unique to the celibate lifestyle, but yeah, they're all really important aspects, the different tests that you do, just to get a bit more information, so they can go, okay, well, this is what Josh is like, and these are things. So they would have little bits around my struggles with anxiety had started emerging. They're not quite to the extent that they had in the years following, but they had a bit of an idea around, okay, well, I have a bit of social anxiety, bit of panic disorder here and there, little bits like that. And so it helps to not only safeguard and provide a good way to check for any red flags, but it helps you to get to know the candidate as well, which is really important.
So then for you, when it came to, trying to understand these vows that you'd have to obviously take, was there any points when you thought, perhaps, okay, am I making the right choice?
Oh, absolutely, man. Oh my gosh. I sort of was up and down and up and down. The formaters won't tell you, but they definitely could tell you. It was a bit of a roller coaster. I remember got about 3 or 4 weeks, I thought, have I made the right decision? And they're like, oh, that was pretty quick. That's good. But they're like, you've got to wrestle with it. If you've got someone who enters into this way of life, which can at times be a really difficult way of living, and they have no qualms ever, you're kind of like, oh, what's actually...
Something's wrong
here, So it's it's not to say there's a whole lot of guys who have a whole lot of struggles, but they never waver in the decision. That's different. But people who just go, oh, I'm just sort of plodding along and it's all fine and hunky-dory, then that's always a bit of a red flag. So I had heaps of... one of the really funny ones that I love talking about was in my second year. So I'd had my anxiety stuff had started picking up in my first year in 2015, and I got into my second year and things were just kind of difficult. I was challenging. I was really sort of just labouring with a whole lot of stuff, and I sort of got to this point. I was like, oh no, this is it. It's too hard. Like I don't know I can keep doing this anymore. And so they said, oh, well, look, let's set let's do a bit of a discernment exercise. Let's set a tentative leaving date. So I set the 14th of May, and that was about 6 to 8 weeks away. And we said, oh, look, let's leave it for 4 weeks. And then in 4 weeks' time, if you think, no, I'm resolved, and then, okay, that's what we'll move towards. Anyway, so I wasn't sure, and I was getting really frustrated. I remember I'd had this day. So Friday was a day of prayer, so we'll just have a day in silence and we'll be praying, and whatever way works for us. And I remember walking around Red Hill in Canberra, we had this little old house in this really affluent suburb, and we're walking around, and I was getting really sort of, getting really cranky and moody and all of that. And anyway, and then that evening we had a 5:30 mass on a Friday evening, and all of the brothers we took turns serving at the altar, and it was my turn to serve, and I was really kind of grumpy, and then the guy who's now the head of the Missionaries, Father Steve, he comes into the sacristy where we all sort of get dressed and whatnot for mass, and he's kind of just running on the spot. And I was like, mate, what are you doing? This is a serious place. And I was getting a bit sort of short and cranky. And he's like, I've getting my steps up. I haven't hit 10,000 steps today. I've got to get my steps up. And there was something in that, and just like he's such a bit of a larrikin. He's so relaxed and funny in that way. There was something in that which is I sort of felt like my heart was sort of set concrete at the time, and there was something in that which just sort of cracked within me, my heart, and just softened me a little bit. And then we got dressed, and then it just happened that we had 4 or 5 priests for that mass, which is pretty rare for a weekday mass. And so I processed in first, and I stood to the side holding the cross. And then each of them went up 2 by 2 to venerate the altar and then take their seats. And I remember just seeing they go up 2 by 2, just thinking, this is what I want to do. This is what I meant. This is who I'm meant to be. And there I am in the middle, and I start weeping. And I'm meant to be serving, and I'm thinking, what on earth? And I'm trying to be like, I'm not crying. And anyway, and then I got through mass, and we came down, and then we had a time what we call adoration. So we have the bread, which we believes becomes the body of Christ, and we put it in this big sort of gold thing called a monstrance to sort of draw attention to it, and we just pray before that, believing that Jesus is present there on the altar. And I remember just kneeling there, and I started weeping again. And this one of the priests, a great friend of mine, he leans over to me, he goes, "You're right, man." I was like, "No, I'm not okay." And it was just, and it was a great moment of going, this is actually what I want to do. And there's a number of those little moments through the journey, which have become little kind of, little reminders, little Ebenezer stones, that I can pile up and go, no, this is actually proof that I'm in the right place, and I'm sort of where God wants me to be, where I want to be. Yeah. Which has been really important.
And then, out of curiosity, how did your siblings take it?
Well, it's really interesting. So I used to say, I'm in a bit of an Australian modern family in a way. So like my older sister, she was in a charismatic community for a little while. Her and her husband, they're pretty into their faith. My second sister, a little bit. So she's sort of remarried, and she's kind of into her faith a little bit. And then my brother Tim, he's gay and he's not really into things at all. So various different ways. So on the whole, people are pretty supportive. My brother's wrestled with it a fair bit, I think, and that's been interesting. Just leading into the ordination, there's been some wrestles with that around, to who's coming and how people feel about coming along and that sort of stuff. And but on the whole, I mean, my family's always been pretty supportive. It's very much a bit of a classic sort of Australian, if it makes you happy, you'll be, you do you, and we'll back you in, and so they've always been really good, really kind of supportive, and mum and dad as well. I think they would have liked for me to have been a little bit closer to home for a lot more, but I think once I spent a bit of time up here in Sydney, they realised I wasn't always going to live 10 hours away, so I think they've enjoyed the moments when I'm just half an hour up the road. So,
out of curiosity, and we don't have to go into too much detail if you don't want to, but I'm a bit curious for your brother Tim, and growing up in, I guess, a religious household, so to speak. That would have been very challenging for him, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think so. And we haven't spoken about it a lot. Like we sort of, I think we have a reasonably good relationship, but we've had moments where we've come and we've gone back and forth on this sort of stuff. I can definitely tell that he's been on his own journey with it all, and I've always tried, maybe not successfully, but I've always tried to be really understanding of, this must be really hard for you, that there's a context here which you might not necessarily feel quite at home in or safe in or accepted in terms of us, the rest of my family being part of a church and a church which, even if often misunderstood about what it actually teaches, can be felt to be quite antagonistic towards people with same-sex attraction and whatnot, and recognising, well, that's actually that's a difficult thing to hold, and to hold in an area of your life which is felt so deeply and to the core of who you are. I think that's one of the interesting things about it. It's because it's almost like, there's a difference between if you're born that way versus if it's something that you pick up, through society and culture. There's things that we learn obviously by watching other people do it, and there could be that aspect to it, but then there are people that, believe that they're just born that way. And then if that's the case, then, what does that mean for their relationship with God? Does that mean that I'm an aberration? Or is there something more to this, and I think that's a very interesting question. I don't have an answer. I don't, maybe perhaps you do. No, I mean, that's something I've wrestled with and really tried to, and that's something, and I've, you know, even with some of my work with young people of having this conversation, you know, people going, well, look, this is my lived experience and I really wanted to make it work, but I just don't feel like the answers I get from the church don't satisfy, you know, and I just feel this way. And this might be a bit of a cop-out. I don't think it is, but it might be. But my response has always been, look, I don't think, like they don't need another person saying, well, this is what the church teaches and this, and trying to rationalise it, because I don't think it's necessarily a rational thing. I think it's a felt thing. And I think, you know, and this is separate to, like, my family's a whole nother conversation. But in terms of my work and my ministry work, and work's probably the wrong word, my way of just being in the world, of who I've been called to be, as a missionary of God's love, is my task, I guess, is to love people. And that's big. What does it mean to love people? Again, that's a complex question. But I think the most important thing I can do is to hey, look, I don't necessarily know the answers, but I'm committed to, if you want to, creating a space where we can explore them, that we can ask these questions and you can wrestle with them. And I'm going to be here to support you in that and help you to feel comfortable enough that God's big enough to handle all your questions. Because I think a lot of people think, because often we're not big enough to handle questions, we kind of project that onto God and go, well, God doesn't want to have the conversation. But my experience of all of my issues, you know, my anxiety and all that I've wrestled with, is that God was with me in the very midst of that, in the darkest of that, and that's where he wanted to be. So if that's true for me in that place, then I deeply believe that for people who do wrestle with these questions and their questions are like that go to the core of their identity, that God wants to meet them in that place too, and just sit with them first to go, okay, actually you're acceptable and I love you, and we'll explore, sure, where that all fits in. But the first thing is that you're acceptable and I love you. And as a missionary of God's love, I've got to try and I'm called to, I don't have to, but I'm called to try and to minister God's love in that way. I do it very poorly, I think. You have to ask others to see how I go, but that's always been the challenge I feel that I've been called to. And it's a really difficult place because I don't have the answers. I'm not I'm pretty switched on, but I'm no great theologian. I definitely don't have all the answers. But I just try and minister God's love to people in a way which isn't going to be condescending or patronising or cheap either. You know, and that's hard. It's a hard tension to hold.
Very difficult. You know, I think often people just maybe they want to feel understood, and that we put all this pressure on in terms of our own thinking about how we view ourselves. We're probably the harshest critics of ourselves, right? Anybody who's not a harsh critic of themselves, well, there's probably some element of psychopathy. Psychopathy. I don't know what's the correct pronunciation there, but yeah,
sounds good to me.
Yeah, you're probably a little bit psychotic if you're not hard on yourself and you're not self-critical.
I've been. This is just a fun anecdote. I've been, ordinations coming up, so I'm practicing maths, right? Yeah. So I was recording myself yesterday, and I watched it back, and I thought, I look like a cormorant, one of those birds that puts their wings out to dry. I thought, oh, look, I'm all arms and legs and I've got this facial twitch thing going on, which I'm always very aware of and no one else really notices, but I always know that I'm doing it. I'm like, I look absolutely stupid. I've got to get this sorted out 9 days to figure out what I'm doing. And one of the brothers here, he said, mate, you're fine. You're doing okay. Don't worry about it. But we're our own harshest critic. We're always the quickest to go, hang on a second, that's the...
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Like even when it comes to delivering mass, all right? Like if you're doing 2 or 3 masses in a day, it might be your third one and you're tired and blah blah blah. But for those people that have come to church, that could be their first one.
Yeah, that's right. They're fresh. They're thinking, all right, come on, let's go.
Yeah. So we use this. I used to use the same analogy, for guys selling cars, right? Like you might have had a horrible day. Just had arguments with customers or whatever the case may be. And, you get that one customer in the afternoon and it's like, hey, you need to reset yourself because although you might have seen 5 or 6 customers today, you might be the first salesperson that they've seen today.
Yeah.
Right. And so that could be the difference between having an engaging and a positive interaction versus a negative one. So, so we've digressed a little bit. I always found that a very interesting conversation because I feel like a lot of people when they, think of how religion views, alternative lifestyles and things like that. That's like, okay, it's very judgmental. Whereas, and part of the reason why I think it feels judgmental is because we sort of accept that, normal life, so to speak, is normal life, and anything that is not normal is therefore abnormal. whereas, it's a very wide range in terms of what people experience and what people feel and go through in life. And I feel like, so for me, I guess where I'm sort of at in my faith journey, so to speak, is that, if you'd ask me, okay, do I believe in a God? Well, yes, I believe in a God. Or you can call him a creator, you can call him whatever you want him to be, right? But, at the end of the day, to me, I sort of think that, whatever name you espouse, it's still the same thing. Like, it's still the same entity, so to speak, right? Because, if you think about the nature or the objectiveness of maths, is that, before you can have anything, you need to have one, right? And that one, no matter how infinitely large or infinitesimally small, is still one, right? Like, you have to have something that starts everything, right? And then the question that I grapple with, so, obviously what I sort of, go through is trying to understand, okay, well, for me to have this, I think it's important that everybody should have that, their own personal relationship with God or the creator or whatever you want to call this entity, so to speak. And that's irrespective of whatever life that you lead, right? Like, I sort of view it as, if you think about your own parents, right? Everybody would have a set of parents, but how well do you get on with your parents? For some people, they don't want to have any association with their parents. Perhaps they had a traumatic childhood, so to speak. But knowing that there is, well, I guess having this belief that there is something that started all this, well, then I think it's important for me personally to be able to express some gratitude that, I get to live a life, that, what are the chances of, you as a particular being here at this specific moment in time? Like, that's something amazing to begin with. And so then I think there's an important aspect of that. And I also think about it from the perspective of, it's like, when you, if you were to go and ask your dad for something, and let's say you haven't spoken to him, for the last 30 years, and then you turn around and say, hey, Dad, can you give me $5,000? He's going to, he's probably going to be like, what? Maybe if your dad's got the money and he's like, okay, yeah, whatever, I'll help you. But, there's going to be some questions, right? And it's the same thing. Like, I feel like people often turn to spiritual guidance or spirituality when they're in a time of need. And not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but I feel like, if it comes, when you think about a relationship is a two-way street, right? So it shouldn't just all be about me, me at the center of the universe. And there's a funny parallel there when you think about, how people used to think that the earth was the center of the universe, right? So I think there's an interesting parallel there, is because when we think that we are the center of the universe, that's when we become very selfish. We become very self-centered, and we focus on things that are material as opposed to things that might be more important, right? But when you realize that there is a sun at the center of our solar system and we revolve around the sun, that's almost like saying, okay, if you take away the sun and say that was God, and we revolve around God, God is not necessarily, us, so to speak, but we revolve around this being. That sort of opens you up to this different interpretation in terms of, like, how do you approach that, right? So I guess, selfishly, I'm sort of curious about what your thoughts might be on this, but, what I sort of grapple with is that, okay, if I've come to this, my own self-agreement that there is a God that exists, I still have the question that I haven't had answered is, how important is the name of this God, right? Because, and I know there's ramifications for it, right? Like, obviously, if the God's name is Jesus, then obviously that's, you're a Christian denomination, and there are certain, I guess, rights and things like that you need to sort of understand from that perspective. If the name of God is Allah, then, there's certain Islamic rights and that sort of thing that need to be adhered to, right? So, sort of listening to me ramble on about that, like, I guess, what is your sort of perspective in terms of?
Yeah, and I think, I often, and this is something I've come to learn, just particularly, I guess, in the time of my formation for the priesthood, and it's probably something I knew kind of implicitly, but I've come to understand more explicitly, so there's something, and say like Christianity, it's probably what I know the most. You'd be worried if it wasn't, right? But, but like in terms of, and often we think, oh, well, Jesus is God, and then the Holy Spirit and God, and then there's the Father, and that's the Trinity, but we don't really get our head, half of us are probably, maybe not half of us, but half of us think there's actually three gods, not one, and anyway, it all gets very confusing, and people, they just think, oh, no, it makes sense. And we can't kind of take it for granted, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But when you actually you dig deep into, and just say looking at Jesus, for example, that if Jesus is who he says he is, that if he is God and if he's the revelation of the Father, then there's a whole lot in both who he is and what he says and what he teaches about God that actually shows that Christianity in itself is really kind of distinct amongst a whole manner of, if not all of the world religions, in that Christianity is really about that God comes to be one of us so that we could become like God. So I think it's Irenaeus says, that God becomes man so that man can become fully God, right? So that's in its beginning it says, well, that's really kind of weird, and you think, oh, surely that's not quite right. But the whole idea is that Jesus has created us. If God is one, that He's created us. And we Holy Trinity, three persons in one God. That God is this relation which is one, but in the same time is three. The old saying is, if you explain the Trinity well, you haven't explained the Trinity at all. But this whole idea that even in God's very nature is to be one, and that in giving his Son, and so is Jesus coming and becoming human, becoming one, he adopts human nature, so that when he actually dies and he rises from the dead, not only does he bring new life, but he ascends into heaven. When he returns, so to speak, to heaven, he brings humanity with him. That he doesn't cease to be fully human. And it's saying, well, if that's true, and Jesus sort of goes to make a place for us, as he says in Scripture, it's actually, well, our entire purpose, our telos, our end, is that we would enter into the life of God so fully that would enter into the life of the Trinity. And there's something unique about that in Christianity versus other religions. It's not just about finding peace while we're alive. It's not just about becoming one with the earth and creation. It's actually, it's not just about escaping our humanity, but it's about entering our humanity so much, because when we enter into heaven, our humanity is there, so we don't lose that, and that's sort of it's a little bit sort of edgy and deep and all that sort of stuff, and there's a whole lot unsaid in that, because if I explain it all, which I probably couldn't do anyway, we'll be here for hours, but and there's something unique in that, I think, which and Henri de Lubac is this French theologian who talks about this in his book Catholicism. He says, well, there's something unique in Christianity as an idea, as a religion, that it, often people think, all religions are all the same. They all talk about it's all about living the good life and that sort of stuff. And morality is important. Ethics and morality are a key part of what it means to be a Christian. But the very heart of it is that we're invited to enter into God's life. And I think that's something that's kind of unique in Christianity. And I say all that because I think the claims that each religion makes, it's not just about the ethic and about the way of living. It's actually about the very substance of who we are as human beings. This goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning around these Christian ideas that form a lot of, the way the West works. That all this is very, why marriage is such a fundamental, and even if we're not married to talk about relationship, that everyone wants to be in a relationship, and so the controversial about, divorce and remarriage in the church, for example, that if wanting to be in a relationship with someone else, to give myself completely to another person wasn't so core to who we are, then people will be like, oh, well, I tried getting married, it didn't work, so I'm not going to give it a go again. I don't need to. Obviously, there's something deeply written into us that we're drawn towards that, if that makes sense. So I think a lot of that sort of stuff comes into the core of the question. Okay, well, some people go, well, look, any religion's fine, it doesn't really matter. That whole universalist idea that, that we can, the whole coexist, you see those bumper stickers, one's the Islamic sort of half crescent moon and all that sort of stuff. And I just think that doesn't hold water because, none of those faiths actually really would say that. Maybe there's a bit of that in Hinduism, that there's kind of like, oh, we're open to all sorts of gods. And
polytheist.
Yeah, but I think for the majority, I think of, or at least majority of people who follow religion, maybe not the majority of religions, but I think in the lived experience, people recognise, well, actually, this whole thing that we're probably all right anyway, that doesn't really hold water. People sort of go, well, it doesn't really fit. That we have different claims for what it means to be true. But I think if you were to sort of say, well, look, a Muslim or a Christian, it doesn't really matter. They're probably both right. Then it doesn't really, it doesn't quite, stand up. Because if that's true, then God's probably been quite misleading in calling people to this or the other, and actually saying, well, look, so the Muslims, they can't drink alcohol and can't eat pork. I'm showing my lack of understanding here, but. Well, if God's good, why would he not then go, oh, you don't have to do that, so why would you do it in the first place? But do you know what I kind of mean? Like it's sort
I understand.
of,
Yeah. So I guess, how I sort of view the logic behind that is that, you know, for us, like as an example, if we look at a cup, right?
Yeah.
We're both on opposite ends of the table, but because the cup is sufficiently round and we have seen many a cup, that we can discern that, hey, this is a cup, right? But now if this cup was so large that, you know, you and I, rather than sitting at this table staring at, you know, this thing that I can hold in my hand, we're perhaps just looking at, you know, you might be looking at the little ribbing on the side of the edge of the cup, and I'm looking at the arc at the top. But perhaps, you know, the arc is so large that it looks like a straight line to me. For as far as my eye can see, I look at it and I go, it's not a cup because it's a straight line. Like this would have to be the universe's gigantic cup for it to be straight from where I am. Just like how, you know, the Earth is round, but from where we look, you know, it looks like it's flat.
Pretty flat, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I often come to that conclusion where it's like, because I haven't really gotten this answer, you know, this and you know, it's interesting because, you know, compared to another friend, so my other friend would have like he's sort of got this burden of proof that he's looking for to go and say, okay, well, this would determine whether it exists or not. You know, if this particular, you know, as an example, a medical miracle could occur where somebody, you know, could get prayed over and experience a healing aspect and has the medical records to prove it and blah, 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 that would be sort of like the catalyst for him to say, okay, I can believe that. Whereas for me, you know, I don't have that specific burden of proof. I've got probably I'm relying more on something internal, like, you know, something that will just click, because once it clicks, it's like you can't unsee it once you've experienced it, right? Sure. So it's interesting because, you know, he and I have very different standards in terms of what we're looking for. But we're probably both in agreement in terms of like where we're at in terms of, okay, do we believe a God exists? Okay, for that particular question, we've gotten an answer. We say it's a yes. But what does that mean? You know, I find that to be a very interesting thing because, like going back to my analogy about the cup is that, you know, quite often I would think that it's not necessarily that God's been misleading. It's our own human interpretation, because we can't necessarily understand all the ways that God would be working within our lives. Like, it goes back to the suffering question, right? Like, why are some people so fortunate, you know, that we can be born here in Australia and live this life in an amazing Western society, but then there are people on other parts of the world who, you know, may not even survive to the age of 3, right? Through malnutrition or starvation or all these sorts of problems. And so, like, I guess one of the other things that I was thinking about was that when you were talking about, you know, like the idea behind us or Jesus paving that pathway for us to rejoin him in heaven, and sort of bringing that humanity to heaven. One of the sort of, I guess, images that I got when I was, you know, going through this psychedelic experience was like, you could almost view lives like this amazing tapestry, right? And tapestry, you know, I would say it was like I'll describe it like almost like a snake skin, so to speak. Like it was that kind of a look where it was like, even like the David Jones symbol, you know, where it's like that black and white sort of herringbone style. And, you know, I guess to sort of illuminate the point, it's like, so if you imagine like, you know, like a silver patch and a black patch, right? And if you were to touch the silver patch or you touch the black patch, it didn't really matter which one you touched, but it would shoot off into, you know, amazing like fireworks, so to speak, and then poof, it's gone, right? And the insight that I gained was like, okay, well, that was somebody's life that just, you know, glow, you know, lit up like a fireball in the sky and then was extinguished in a heartbeat, like literally a second, right? Like that's relative to the human experience, right? We're here for maybe 80 to 100 years if we're lucky, right? But in the scheme of things, 80 to 100 years isn't a very long time. You're thinking about, you know, how long has the world been in existence? And whether it was a silver patch or a black patch, it didn't matter. You know, you touch one, off it goes, psh, and then that life's gone. And then it starts zooming out and you see, okay, there's a lot of lives here. And you keep zooming out and this infinitely large tapestry. It's like, if all of those represent a life, you know, at the end of the day, we all rejoin God at the end of the day. And I know that would probably be counterintuitive to the Christian idea that, you know, there's a heaven and a hell, so to speak. But, you know, the sort of, and this is where I think it's probably going to get a little bit complicated, because Ange will then, you know, start talking about what's the the area between heaven and hell.
Purgatory.
Purgatory. Yeah. We started getting into a conversation on purgatory, but so I guess the point that I'm trying to make with this is that when it comes to the interpretation of what might be right or wrong, perhaps we may never know until we die anyway, right? We can live our lives with this idea that this is supposed to be true, and I think there's actual positives in doing that, because if you're wrong, you've still lived a good life anyway, right? But if you're right, then what is it worse to be, right? But I feel like, it's the human element that everything is up to a person's interpretation. That's where, we could be seeing we might be looking at the same thing, but having two totally different perspectives on it.
Yeah, and I think, I love that cup analogy. One of my favourite philosophers is a guy called Hans-Georg Gadamer. He's this German guy. I'm pretty sure he's dead now, but he lived to a ripe old age of, feels like it was 180. I think he was about 96 or something when he died. And he's well known really for his approach to hermeneutics. So he would sort of say that it's through our understanding that we sort of know that we exist. So we come to know our being, our ontology, through how we interpret things. And so Gadamer's hermeneutics, that's his great contribution. And he uses it for a whole range of art and whatever. But I really like it in terms of this stuff about exploring things like faith, because it's really helpful. And he uses something like a cup. So he would say, well, this cup exists, and I'm looking at it, and so I understand it in a certain way, and then it communicates back to me, and then there's this back and forth. It's like this oscillation of sort of knowledge, and more and more I'm coming to understand the cup more and more as I'm going on. You think about, say, the first time you walked into your new home, and then 20 years later when you walk in, you don't view it the same way. That your understanding of it has changed and developed, and so he would say, that, and the way he does this is, and this contributes, this isn't called the cup analogy, mind you, this is the underlying reality. And then so when it comes to the cup, I'm seeing it in a certain way, and so my lens through which I'm seeing it impacts my understanding of it, and then that changes. Then if I rotate the cup, I'm seeing another aspect of it in a certain way, and I'm getting more information. So I think you're right in saying, we look at the cup from different perspectives. And this is what I love this in history. So I love history, and I love the study in what we call historiography. It's the study of history. There's different lenses through which we can view history. And this is true in theology as well. We have different theologies, the idea of feminist theology and queer theology, which used to drive me up the wall when I was younger, but I see the value in it now, because all it is different people's perspectives on God and trying to seek understanding. Theology is faith seeking understanding, seeking to understand what we know about God, right? So if we use that analogy of the really big cup, I see it, I see maybe the ribs down the bottom, you see the top, but I can't see the ribs and go, okay, well, that's a man because a man has ribs, even though I can't see the whole thing. I'm wrong if I say that it's a man, if that makes sense. And so that's what, people would say, well, Gadamer's open to this whole thing, that subjectivity, and then there's no actual objective truth. But Gadamer would hold that I can have my truth, and there's the truth, and my truth probably is a perspective of the truth, if that makes sense. So I look at you might have a rough cut diamond, so I look at the diamond from a certain perspective, and you look at the other side, and we can describe it to each other. It sounds like we're describing two different things, but it's actually two sides of the one diamond, if that makes sense. But it's always a diamond, and I think that's part of, again, this is why I say in Christianity we talk about Jesus as the revelation of the Father, or the revelation of God, that Jesus is kind of like, if we think about the big sort of cup, Jesus is the cup shrunk small in a certain way, and that might sound a bit controversial, and it might be, maybe I'll get in trouble, but but what I mean by that is that Jesus is Jesus is kind of God revealed in his humanity. He retains his divinity. He's fully divine, but he becomes one of us that we can see, hear, and touch, and we can listen to him. Jesus is teaching, and so we say that Jesus is the finality of revelation. There's no new revelation because Jesus is revealed it all. So if we had the big cup, we kept turning the cup, we're looking at, if it's super, super big, we've got to get the crane out and the scaffolding and climb up and get at this perspective, and then look at the other side and get a bit more, and we keep drawing the picture. But Jesus is he's the fullness of that. That's what we say, that is the fullness of revelation. So all has been revealed in Jesus. We're just unpacking that because, Jesus is a complex sort of guy, right? So unpacking that as you go on, because God is so deep and mysterious, and that's what we would say, that other religions have elements of the truth, because we're all looking, that thing we were talking about before, that everyone has this spiritualness within them, I guess, for lack of a better word. But all those little, all these glimmers of revelation, I guess, and you hear the creation stories of Indigenous Australian communities. They're great, they're great oral histories, that have some great similarities, and some not similarities, but it's all the seeking of understanding the creation of the world, and so all that sort of plugs in. I guess we would say, as a Catholic, I'd say, well, Jesus is the fullness of that revelation, that all those other things in different ways might point to that, in the same way that, Islam would say, well, there are a monotheist, they'd say, well, there is one God. Judaism would say, well, there is one God. Or say, well, they're pointing to the fact that, well, there is one God. That's what we would say anyway. Does that kind of make sense? I'm not sure I'm really answering any questions, but
no. Well, this is where I always come back to. I think at some point in your life, it is worthwhile to go on this little bit of a faith-based journey to try and understand exactly what you think as well. I guess for me, what I would have thought prior to some of these experiences that I've had was very different to where I'm at now, and I think, through trying to gain that understanding, it also provides you with a lot of self-reflection to then review these lenses that you're given. And people might say, oh no, I don't have lenses on. Well, reality is that from the moment you're born, you're given filters by your parents, your siblings, the friends around you. They're teaching you without instructing you directly, oh, this is how we look at things. That by sheer use of the words that they provide to you, you're picking up on those words, you're using the same language, and that language is actually a filter in itself. And that's a very interesting thing, obviously, for me, being able to speak English and Chinese, the way that I can articulate things in English is very different to how I would try and articulate these concepts and ideas in Chinese. And I find that, so I think, there's something in that, especially across all religions, whether it's Arabic and, and how, I guess the ideas in terms of Allah and God is presented through Arabic would be very different through the Jewish language, like Hebrew and things like that, Greek, Italian, they'd all have very different ways. I think, it's evident in church as well when, if you listen to a Latin-based mass versus an English-based mass, it's a very different feel, isn't it?
And I think, I'm thinking about the fact that, in Greek there's 4 different words for love, for example, but, in colloquial Australian English, there's about 14 different ways of describing being drunk, and so there's different sort of, language even that expresses something, that's sort of something that is a reality. And then you bring in music and you bring in culture, and there's all this stuff that language itself really struggles to communicate, and that's all still communication, and that's still all telling a story.
Yeah.
So when you go into a Latin mass, it's communicating something. When you go into mass here at St. Declan's, it's communicating something different to a mass in a parish down the road.
Yeah.
A whole lot of similarities. And the beauty of the Catholic faith is that, all things going well, you walk into mass anywhere in the world, you kind of have a shape that you're going to get pretty much the same thing, and you know what's going to happen. And that's part of the gift of that, is that it's because it is a gift for the people. It's not in the purview of the priest. The mass doesn't belong to the priest, it belongs to the people. And that it's Jesus' priesthood that we're all sharing in. That's sort of the core theological tenet of that. But again, that communicates something. And I think that's really important too, is that all these things communicate these things beyond just what, say, language can.
Yeah.
Language is extremely powerful and important, but it's not the only way that you can communicate. It's not the only way you can understand either, So.
Yeah, it's funny because it's like when you listen to music, right? It's actually the experience of going through the song that is important, because there's, certain parts that are more upbeat or downbeat, or there's crescendos or a bridge that's in that song that sort of gives that song its life. It's not just about the end note, right? I think often we're always just looking for that final outcome, give me the answer, just tell me the answer, is this real, is this not real? But then it's not really about that. It's about actually going through that song and listening to it from start to finish.
Yeah, this is a bit of a right turn here, but I was preaching about this morning a little bit, in mass and talking about, I remember having that experience, sort of give me the answer when I was particularly in my second year of being in the Missionaries. I had a mental breakdown and, really struggling with anxiety and having panic attacks every couple of days, and it was really really dark and unpleasant. I remember, I kept sort of trying to keep going, and the guy who was kind of looking after us, he came up and gave me a DVD player with a couple of seasons of The West Wing and a bucket of lactose-free ice cream. He said, "Have a week off. If you come to anything, I'm going to send you straight back to bed. You need to relax." And like I wouldn't be out. We had a nursing home, next door to our place, and there's a footpath that went around it. It's about 300 meters, and I couldn't walk that. Like that was just overwhelming, just being outside, And I remember wrestling with this and thinking, why can't God just fix it, and make it all better? And this poor priest, I remember him just saying, look, I can't answer that for you, but you just have to trust that God's in it, and He's loving you in the midst of that. He's going to bring resurrection and new life to you in the midst of that reality. And that was a really difficult journey. I had that breakdown, and that took months to recover from, and and really living with, and got pretty well, and then COVID happened, and then that happened, I got really, end of 2021, similar thing, 10 panic attacks in 14 days, ended up in ED, I was on Valium, and really difficult sort of moments. And then now, sort of just having different moments and growing through that and having a couple of moments where God really turned up in a big way in my life. Whereas I look at where I am now, and God willing, I'm on a good stretch and that'll keep going. But seeing how, having gone through what I've been through, and even before that first breakdown, but particularly on the healing journey through then, knowing what I do now, the way being out, I sat with a young person at one of our conferences over the summer break, and they were having a panic attack, and I knew that I just said, I know exactly what I can do, and I just sat with them for half an hour. Talk them through the breathing exercises, talk them about what the therapy options are, what they're doing, and knowing the language around, what treatment are you getting, all that sort of stuff. And just being able to sit with them and just talk with them, and then being able to go, look, I don't know where I would have been if you weren't able to talk me through that process. Recognise that if I had just got in 1 minute, the solution sort of presented itself and God magically goes, bang, you're fixed already, it's all fine. As much as I really wanted that final answer at the moment, I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't have the resilience, recognizing that, I have become really resilient, and I'm in the fight with a lot of stuff, and life isn't easy for me. But also in terms of, that we talk about the idea of being the wounded healer, or that the area of your brokenness becomes an area of your biggest blessing for the world, that I can speak into this with people, that I can chat with young people. I can chat with older people. I was chatting with a middle-aged woman about this the other week, and just to sit with them and go, okay, and just be able to almost minister peace, like a tangible sort of, it's almost like I jokingly call it the sigh of the Holy Spirit, because I'll just be sitting with them and just sort of be like, and that's tangible, because there's history and there's my story all wrapped up in that. And there's power in all of that, and that's not sort of some kind of humanist thing. It's I think God's moving in that. I think it's God is the one who is acting in that situation. But if I had have got the final answer right away and hadn't gone on the journey, then so much of what's good in my life wouldn't be around. Yeah, and I think that's really. And that's true for so many people in so many different ways, and that can be really hard. And some people, they go through life and they find they never get to that place where they have that breakthrough, they have that moment of the answer coming, and that's really hard. That's really hard. I don't know how to meet people in that, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to wrap this up. It's been a lot of fun, so I hope you enjoyed it.
It's been great. Really good.
So if people want to find you, are you on any social media or anything?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. I was going to say my tag on Instagram at the moment is DCN J Whicker MGL, I think, but that's all going to change when I become a priest. Yeah. But you can find me. I'm often commenting on St. Declan's Catholic parishes Instagram stuff. So Angela's sort of running the show there, I think. So
she does, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm always sort of lurking around commenting, and when I should be doing work. So, but anything, you can find me online. I'm often tagged in some of the St. Declan stuff, or if you look up Josh Whicker MGL, you'll generally find me on Facebook and Instagram at least. And I try not to be on Twitter too much. It's not good for my health. So
that's not good for anyone's health. All right. Thanks, everyone. See ya.
Thanks. See ya.